Live with Arvin Vohra, who is a candidate for the Libertarian Party presidential nomination. And I have a bunch of questions I'm going to ask him. If anyone out there watching live has additional questions, feel free to type them in the chat. I will ask additional questions probably at the end of the interview, unless they seem like short things that I can slide right in there. So let me get right to the questions. First of all, thank you for sitting down with me. I really
I
appreciate it.
appreciate you having me on, Chuck.
So tell us about your background as far as your educational history, your career or careers, and your political history.
Sure. I actually work in education, and my educational background both shaped my path as an educator and it shaped my path in politics. In my education, I attended private school. I went to Brown University where I studied mathematics and economics. And throughout that time, I started to get this sense that the way that education was being done, even at the supposedly best schools, Ivy League colleges, private schools, was somehow intentionally inefficient. And I couldn't put my finger on what it was at the time. Today, of course, I realize that the laws in states make education have to be inefficient. So, for example, private schools are required to spend some minimum amount of time to cover a subject, even if it could be covered in, a third of that time. So, education in a lot of ways was my first indirect introduction to libertarianism, where I saw, before recognizing what I was seeing, the toxic influence of government on education through the inefficiency, through the backwardness. And so that's kind of one of the things that really brought me here.
Okay, did you want to talk more about your career or
Oh yeah, sure.
political races you've
Yeah,
run?
I think I forgot that half of the question. So I started my own business called, it was at the time it was called Arvin Vohra Tutoring in 2001. It then has grown into Vohra Method, and it is a purely free market educational company. We don't get involved in any government contracts. We don't follow any government laws. We take no subsidies. We don't do any of that kind of stuff. And what it's shown me is the amount of innovation that's really possible in education. When I look at the people who are my competitors, right, the people that I'm supposedly competing against, I see in them natural allies. I see in them the people who are so excited for education to be this big, wonderful free marketplace. And one of the things that I'm working to do is to make education as varied, as innovative, as economically productive as the tech sector. I believe that if we get rid of all government involvement in education right away, that within weeks, we'll see the kind of economic growth in the United States in terms of new jobs for teachers and educators and innovators, new options for parents and students. The only thing that I can compare it to would have been the creation of the tech sector, because we are literally talking about essentially the creation of a new economic sector, right? With all the innovation that goes into that. And so working in education now for, about 18, 19 years now, I've gotten to see just how much damage is done by government to people, and also how much innovation happens in the small private sector of education, the comparatively small private sector. I don't know if you've ever been to a homeschool convention, Chuck, but I'm sure you at least know of them. You see so many different curricula and teachers and games and methods competing. And that to me is what education should look like. We should have more choices in education than we have in restaurants. And today, most people, except for the very rich, have fewer choices in education. One of the things that I've actually done as part of my career more recently has been to try to correct that divide. It's something called the AP Homeschool Project. It's the website for that, by the way, is aphomeschool.com. And what we're trying to do, it's members of my campaign and members of my business working together to try to provide a clear system for anyone who's ready to opt out of government schools or opt out of private schools to give themselves a better education than what you can get anywhere else for free.
That's very interesting. So when I was in high school, I took more AP exams than I took courses for. So sometimes
You and I have that in common. Yeah, I remember
I would
that.
just grab a book and read it and then take the test, and I did pretty well at that. And I think more people could benefit from that sort of studying.
One of the things that's interesting is, and this to me just shows like if you take government and regulation out of something, it becomes just so much faster. One of the things that I'm sure you also noticed is that when you're doing your AP exam training without government help, the government help, it takes less time and you get a higher score, or maybe in your case probably equivalently high score, but you get in less time you get more done because you're not being required to waste time on nonsense. And that to me is something that extends to all parts of American life. Almost every part can be made faster, more efficient, more beneficial simply by just subtracting government.
So, can you talk to me about any executive or managerial experience you have that you think would transfer to being president of the United States in charge of such a large agency infrastructure?
Sure, sure. And a big part of my experience comes from knowing when to shed some large parts of that structure. And I do think there's a lot of that structure that needs to go. I would say most of it. But if you want to talk about my personal executive experience, there's going to be two that I think are most relevant. One is by working on the LNC. I was the vice chair of the LNC for 2 terms, and I know you were also you used to be the vice chair of the LNC, right, back in the day.
Yep.
I was the vice chair of the LNC for 2 terms. I was a representative at large for 1 term. And as part of the LNC, as being on the LNC, you do make some of those big decisions. What can we afford? What do we need to get rid of? What are other ways that we can address some of these same needs? How have some things changed because the world has changed? As an example, when some of the original plans were made, we didn't have the information age. We didn't have this massive internet that allows us to share information so quickly. And so things change over time. The other experience that I have is from the entrepreneurial side. I've started my own business when I was 22. I've grown it since then, and it went from a one-man operation to something where we have a few full-time staff and then a few part-time staff as well. So it's something where I've seen both sides of it. And the key part of that is this: having been on the entrepreneurial side, I know exactly how government can help and how they can hurt. And the biggest way that the government can help businesses grow, entrepreneurs have more of an advantage, is to simply get out of it. When I talk to other entrepreneurs who started their own businesses, very few, not none, but very few said, well, I got this help from the government and then I got started. Most of them complain about the regulations and nuisance that government created, the roadblocks it created to new entrants. So one of the things that I think it's important that libertarianism brings forth is that idea that sometimes the best way to help something is to just get out of its way and let it do what it naturally does so well.
Thank you. So, just to clarify for the audience, in case they're not aware, LNC stands for Libertarian National Committee. So, Arvin was vice chair, basically, of the Libertarian Party for 2 terms. So, the people at home might not see how being vice chair and being at large translates to executive experience. But
Sure.
I'm aware that when you were vice chair, you took a large hand in managing the Facebook. And
Sure.
so could you talk about how you took charge of that?
Sure. So as vice chair and as representative at large, we're given sometimes these nearly impossible tasks, right? When I started working on the social media page, which you'd actually started up and then passed over to the LNC, and then the LNC for a while hadn't done very much with it. When I when John J. Myers and I took over that, here's what we had: we had no budget at all, but we did have something, right? We had the tools, we had the outreach, we had the Libertarian Party name that we could use. And so what I did is essentially, with no resources, no financial resources at all, found ways to enlist volunteers, to create social media design teams, graphic design teams, and have them work together to really create a purely voluntary system to get a really massive task done. And because of that, we grew the page from essentially something that wasn't doing very much when the LNC was handling it, to one of the biggest, like most dynamic, most exciting parts of libertarian social media anywhere. And it's become for many the gold standard that other people look up to, that state chairs inside the Libertarian Party look up to, that people in the libertarian movement outside of the LP look up to for guidance. And it really shows how much you can accomplish with good strategy, even if you don't have any money. I'm having a little bit of allergies, so I'm just going to dry my eyes here for a second. Don't worry, this interview hasn't brought me to tears yet, Chuck. But with that ability, with that ability to do things voluntarily, we were able to accomplish so much with no money. And the thing is, the same is true in larger parts of government. There's a lot that can be accomplished not by force, not through bribery or money, but honestly just by asking, by saying, here's the thing we're trying to do. Can we work together on this? It's one of the things that most presidents, really since Reagan, haven't done much with, the power of simply asking the American people to help with something. And that, to me, if I exert any kind of leadership as president, it's not going to be through force. It's going to be through asking. The only thing that I'll be doing through force is I will be by force bring the troops home. I'll be by force pardoning nonviolent drug offenders. I'll be doing things like that by force. But any large scale projects will be done through voluntarism.
Why are you running for president?
I'm running for president for a few reasons, but the big two reasons are that I want to end the welfare state and I want to end the income tax. The welfare state, to me, is toxic. It is toxic to the people who it's supposed to benefit because it's created generations of dependency. It's toxic to the people who would be helping other people, but instead have now been learned to see them as enemies. Today, instead of seeing the downtrodden or people who are struggling or people who are trying to overcome difficulties as our fellow brothers and sisters who are facing difficulties, people we should help, we've almost been conditioned to view them as kind of a nuisance. And that is a direct consequence of using forced welfare rather than voluntary charity. Charity is uplifting. Charity uplifts both the people who receive the charity and the people who do it. It taps into the best parts of people. Welfare is the opposite. It just brings out the worst in everybody. I believe the government right now is afraid of charity because they keep blocking it. They've blocked church leaders from housing homeless people inside the church. They've blocked casinos in Las Vegas from donating food to the homeless. They blocked hunters for the homeless from donating, killed and properly treated, freshly killed meat that had been dressed and prepared and freeze dried and vacuum packed and all that stuff. They prevented them from doing that because they know that the biggest threat to them is not that we keep fighting each other, because if we fight each other, we're just divided and conquered. But the biggest threat that they face is that we work together. And charity, by definition, is people working together. It's what they fear, and it's the thing that I believe in very strongly. The income tax, I also believe, needs to go. And the way they want to get rid of it is not by finding some other way to fund big government, but rather by cutting spending, cutting it to 1998 levels, cutting it to 1992 levels. Obviously, I'd love to cut it to 1776 levels, but cutting it as much as we possibly can so that we no longer need to have any kind of an income tax. 1998 levels means we can get rid of the income tax. Cutting it even further means we can get rid of excise taxes, tariffs, and the like.
How would you describe the libertarian philosophy to a voter unfamiliar with libertarians?
So the philosophy is basically, do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting anybody. But I think it's important for us to be very clear with voters. So when I talk to voters, I try to explain to them not what benefits them the most or what harms them the most, but what is going to be the most significant change in their lives. For most people, for most voters, that's going to be, in my view, that's going to be government schools. Government schools are used by a lot of people. It's the largest welfare program in the country. And so that's often where I begin the conversation because I want to be clear, upfront, and honest. I'm not trying to use some sort of a salesman's yes ladder to trick people into believing something. I'm trying to tell the absolute truth in the most significant way. And when I bring that up, some people say, yeah, not interested. Other people say, well, that's insane. Can you tell me more? Other people say, thank God, I've been waiting for somebody to say that my entire life. Whatever somebody's response is, the key belief that I have there is that your first conversation is not going to be your last conversation. The first time somebody hears of libertarianism is not the last time. I started out as a very moderate libertarian. The idea of anarcho-capitalism struck me as absolutely insane. But I talked to more and more ANCAPs. I learned more about the philosophy, largely because I wanted to prove them wrong. But for whatever reason, I learned more about the philosophy. And then I eventually came around to it. And I believe that the same is true. To me, all politics begins with treating people as adults, which means saying to people, listen, here's what we believe. Here's the biggest, most radical, extreme change in your day-to-day life. Let me tell you why it's good if you're interested in hearing more. And a lot of people are, a lot of people aren't, and that's fine. Our job is to be able to educate people to the extent that they want to be educated, not to browbeat and force people into believing what we believe.
So I think you touched on this a little bit before, but maybe you can expand more. What are your top 3 issues for your campaign, and can you talk about each one?
Sure. Start off by talking a little bit about the role that I plan to take on as partner in chief. I believe that if there is no victim, there is no crime. So I would immediately pardon, if elected, I would immediately pardon everyone in jail for a drug crime, everyone in jail for sex work, anyone in jail for just possessing a weapon and not, using it for anything nefarious, and anybody in jail just for a cryptocurrency related charge. So, and I would do that on my first day. I would pardon Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, Ross Ulbricht, and then all these nonviolent non-criminals. One of the reasons that I've chosen to make that a centerpiece is that if I'm the nominee but not elected, I want to be able to use that soapbox, if you will, to remind people that jury nullification gives us all the right to be a partner in chief. Jury nullification brought freedom of the press to America. Jury nullification is something we can use today to halt the drug war, to halt the war against sex workers, to halt a lot of these things. And so I remind people, and I'm going to remind people watching right now, is if you're on a jury and it's some non-crime, then just say not guilty. You cannot be guilty of something that isn't a crime. So that's my first thing. The second thing is I want to shut down foreign military bases and bring the troops home. I don't think that we need to be in Germany anymore. I think that the risk of Germany attacking France is small to non-existent. I don't think we need troops in Japan anymore. Again, that's something that's kind of past. But in the larger sense, I don't believe it is our job to be the policeman of the world. I don't think we should be in alliances that don't benefit us. So as an example, excuse me for a second, Chuck. As an example, the alliance between the United States and France is militarily beneficial to France, no question. It makes them safer, but it doesn't benefit the United States at all. The United States is not any more or less safe because of our alliance with France. So to me, our military should be the smallest military we can have, the smallest and most affordable, the cheapest military that we can have to defend America only, not to defend everyone in the world from everyone else in the world, but just to defend the United States. And I think that can be done very cheaply with a massive reduction in taxes and spending. And finally, as a culmination, I want to end the income tax. Now, I don't want to replace the income tax with some other revenue stream. That's the key. I want to cut spending and end the income tax. I don't want us to ever have to deal with that ever again. And I don't want there to be a mechanism to fund things like endless war, the war on drugs, all that kind of stuff. So I want the government to have less money. My goal is to starve the beast, not to find some other way to feed it.
Uh, I'm sure you're very familiar with the Libertarian Party platform. Is
Sure.
there any plank in the platform that you disagree with? If so, which one or ones and why?
No, there's nothing in there that I disagree with. There are some things, there are some strategies in there that I don't agree with, which is some of the planks I believe have been written intentionally confusingly so that people are not put off by them. I don't think that's a good strategy. I think that just as many people will be excited by a bold and clear plank as will be put off by the bold and clear plank. And the people who are going to be put off by that bold and clear plank, I mean, they're not going to be they're not going to be our allies anyway. I mean, there are some people who fundamentally believe through and through that government schools are the best thing ever. I mean, they're never coming over, so that's fine. Our job isn't to convince everyone in the world; it's to provide information to those who want it. So that to me is something that I would want to see done a little bit better. At previous conventions, I have argued in favor of wording that's clearer, but it hasn't been about changing the meaning of the planks. It's just about making it more accessible and comprehensible by somebody who's reading it for the first time.
How many state conventions have you visited in person for your campaign, and how many have you addressed remotely?
Uh, it's been a lot. I couldn't give you the number off the top of my head. 20-ish probably, maybe more. I don't know the exact number there, but it's we've been to a lot of states.
Let's talk about your campaign infrastructure. Who's your campaign manager?
My campaign manager is Gabrielle Yergi.
Do you have a campaign coordinator in all 50 states?
I don't know. We've centralized operations because we're focusing on the national presence. So, as an example, a lot of the outreach I've been doing has been through either major media or podcasts such as your own. And then when we're in a state, then by addressing the convention directly. But I do believe that while to a certain extent, the old saying that all politics local still stands, I believe things have changed a lot. And today, all politics is national and even international. A lot of my interviews have been domestic. A lot of them have been international. I've been interviewed by the major media in 3 other countries, in addition to media inside the United States. And so to me, what we're trying to do is get that message out there as much and as quickly as possible. So we haven't been really focusing on it as a state by state, but rather as a centralized core strategy.
How much money has your campaign raised so far?
Not very much. I mean, we figured that if we're going to be the nominees, we'll raise plenty of money then, and if not, we have more than enough to cover our travel expenses, our advertising expenses right now, and all that.
Um, where can people find out more about your campaign? So your campaign website, your social media, etc.
So the campaign website is votevohra.com. Social media is facebook.com/ I think it's Vohra Education right now, because education is one of my major focuses, both in politics and also in business for that matter. On Twitter, we're at Vote Vohra and also at Arvin Vohra. We have 2 Twitter accounts.
So tell me about your social media plan. What sites do you have a campaign present? Is it just Facebook and Twitter, or are you also big on Instagram, TikToks, Snapchat, Twitch, or like what other sites do you have a presence on?
Our big presence is Facebook and Twitter. I mean, we're just focusing our resources there. We do have an Instagram account, and we have a relatively recent team. It's been a couple months that's been posting on there pretty regularly. But my focus has generally been on Facebook. My personal focus has been on Facebook and Twitter. We're also on Instagram. So if you follow me through Facebook, you'll be able to get to our Instagram page. Just I think the Instagram is Vohra 2020.
If you get the nomination, will you be supporting 50 state ballot access with your campaign resources?
Yes, and I mean I've supported 50 state ballot access my entire time on the LNC, and to me, I mean that's just kind of a strategic no brainer. I mean if you don't have the 50 state ballot access, I mean that's like the most critical piece, right? I mean that's the engine of the car. I mean it's like a computer without a computer chip. If you don't have that, it's very, very critical. And I've been a massive advocate for that for years now. That's not anything new. I always voted for ballot access while I was on the Libertarian National Committee. I've supported it during my campaign in various ways. I've spoken on the topic in many different areas, and to me it's both an important political issue and just an important strategic issue.
Suppose you get the Libertarian Party nomination. Short of getting elected president, do you have any less ambitious goals we can use as metrics to judge the success of your campaign? For example, are you trying
Yes.
to maximize votes, sell books, increase party membership, or some other goal?
Yes. So what I've told people is that if I'm the nominee, then I'm going to make a bigger difference than any other nominee. And here's why. The core view that I have here is that our government, today's government, was produced by our culture. And that if you knock down this government, this culture will recreate this exact government. We saw that in 2019, where Democratic and Republican voters and independent voters, not the evil congressmen, the voters clamored to bring back the little bit of government that had been cut during the partial government shutdown. The reverse, though, is also true. If we change culture, we have a ripple effect on government. So one of the things that I intend to do, and I have been doing it as part of my campaign, is that I'm going to make sure that as many people in America know that jury nullification brought freedom of the press to America. I want to make sure that as many people know that as now know where Aleppo is, thanks to Gary Johnson. And if that many people know where that freedom of the press, that jury nullification brought freedom of the press, that jury nullification is our right, that jury nullification has a proud history in the United States, I believe we will either halt the drug war entirely or reduce it so staggeringly that it will be no longer in anybody's favor to try to waste time and resources pursuing victimless non-crimes. So that's one thing I'm going to do. The second thing that I'm going to do, just as the nominee, this is not even if I'm elected, just as the nominee, the second thing I'm going to do is to encourage the use of cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is obviously, you know better than anybody, depends on network effects. And the more outreach is done, the more press any particular crypto gets, the more powerful it becomes. And so I'll be encouraging people to use cryptocurrency as much as possible. The final piece is encouraging voluntary action. And there's two voluntary actions that I want to encourage. The first is encouraging people to opt out of government schools. If we simply leave, they're going to fold. And so that's where programs like the AP Homeschool Project, that's aphomeschool.com, me discussing the importance of homeschooling and opting out, talking about the damage done by government schools, that's where that comes in. And I promise you this, if I'm just the nominee, again, not even elected, we're going to see more homeschooling and more people, fewer students being damaged by poorly thought out and ill-considered curricula inside of government schools. The other part of that is I'm going to be encouraging more and more young men and women to refuse, sorry about that, Chuck, to refuse to enlist. And that means that I want people to realize that as an adult, you have a moral responsibility to make decisions based on the consequences of those decisions. And that means that if you are enlisting to join the military, you need to be an adult and say, here's what I will do, and ask yourself, is that okay? Do you believe in the current policy, in America's current foreign policy? If you do, I disagree with you, but I can respect that. If you're saying, well, no, I don't agree with it, but I'm just going to blindly follow orders, that's not being an adult. That's not being a moral agent. That's not within the boundaries of any moral philosophy or even international law. So I will be encouraging people to refuse to enlist until American foreign policy changes, and to refuse to join the police until American domestic policy changes. The good news is this is already happening and working. As part of, as I mentioned before, I've driven to many, many, many states. And I've seen often people trying to recruit for police officers, sometimes just one state over, sometimes even two states over. That's how desperate they're getting for officers, because people are saying, listen, I don't want to be part of something that morally heinous. I will not be locking up people who are sick and struggling with addiction just because that enriches a few private prison owners. People are waking up to this, and it's changing. So I'll be using my campaign to encourage that as well.
So let's unpack a few of those. First of all, you talked about jury nullification as being integral to a free press in the U.S. For people who might be unfamiliar, could you tell them what jury nullification is?
Sure. So the reason that we have a jury, one of the reasons we have a jury of our peers rather than a jury of legal experts, is that the jury is supposed to judge not just whether or not the person technically committed the crime, but is that thing actually a crime? And sometimes the answer is no, it's not really a crime. So a classic example was during the Zenger trial, where the facts of I don't know what's happening here, Chuck. I thought I'd turn this thing off. Where the facts of the crime were known, where the newspaper editor he wasn't debating whether or not he had written the article, right? He admitted that, and yet he still felt what he was doing was right. That was a position that his lawyers argued, that he did the supposed crime, but that thing wasn't a crime at all. And therefore they said that he was not guilty. And that established in America the precedent that we should have a free press, including a press that was free to criticize British royal governors. Today, we can do the same thing. We can say, yes, this person did have this much marijuana, this many bags or truckloads or whatever of marijuana, but that's not a crime. So we're saying not guilty. And that's something we can do right now. And we should be doing right now. Jury nullification is the most powerful tool that we have. Now, one thing that people worry about sometimes is that what if they what if they waste the court's time, right? They're saying, well, I'll be wasting the court's time. Isn't that bad? Actually, no. Wasting the court's time is good because while you're wasting the court's time, the court can't take in money. Criminal courts take in tens of thousands of dollars per hour, often $75,000 an hour, $100,000 an hour. So if you hang that court for, say, 10 hours, that's $1 million you're taking away from the state. That's $1 million the state can't use to damage the lives of people. That's $1 million the state can't use to harass minorities. That's $1 million the state can't use to damage education. So in doing that, if you're just stalling the jury, even then you're doing some good. But if you're letting somebody go free who shouldn't be in jail at all, you're doing an incredible moral action. And that is something that I really want to encourage everybody to do. Jury nullification is probably our most important duty as citizens of the United States.
So I've heard jury nullification described as the jury would judge not just the facts but also the law, which is often left to legal experts such as the judge. And I think jury nullification was also used to overcome the fugitive slave laws in the North, where it was against the law to help a slave escape the South, right before the Civil War. But people would routinely be found not guilty, even though factually they were guilty, because those laws were just unjust.
Exactly. Jury nullification has always been used for bad purposes. It's not that its history has been perfect and clean or anything, but today, when we look at what jury nullification is most likely to do, it's most likely to set people free who should not be in jail at all. It's most likely to take people who are struggling with a medical condition. And here's how bad it's gotten. I don't think people realize really how bad it is. You'll have situations like this, for example, Chuck, you'll have somebody who's trying to get clean, all right? They want to get clean. Their family wants them to get clean. The judge wants them to get clean. The jury, everybody wants them to get clean, right? And they have a bad day and they slip up. And that can happen to anybody. I mean, we've all had bad days. Maybe we didn't use drugs, but maybe you ate some candy. Maybe you did something else foolish. Maybe you should have worked and decided to watch 3.5 hours or 13.5 hours of Netflix instead. Maybe you did something else. We've all had bad days. So somebody slips up, they're under pressure, and they use drugs again. And often at the sentencing, judges themselves have spoken out against the sentences. Judges have said, I believe that you're trying to get clean. If this was up to me, I wouldn't give you any sentence at all. However, because of the way that the law is written, I have no choice but to send you to jail. So you have judges who have literally spoken out against their own sentences. That's how bad this war on drugs has gotten. And so jury nullification lets you say not guilty because it's not a crime. It's helping people who are trying to help themselves. Listen, nobody wants to be addicted to drugs. I mean, addiction is not plan A for anybody. You have so many people who are struggling to get clean, and it's hard to get clean. I mean, you think about the addictions that you might have in your own life, right? We all have these sort of petty addictions, whether it's ice cream or TV watching or video games or whatever. And you think that sometimes it can be hard to say, listen, today I'm only going to play an hour of video games and then 23 hours passes, right? We all have that experience, right? Now imagine that it's this chemical dependency that you're trying to overcome. It's hard. It takes work. And because we're human, we sometimes slip up. Is that ideal? No, but it's how life is. And so this is not just about saying, screw you to the government. It's also about just basic human compassion. When somebody's sick, when somebody's struggling, we should be trying to help them, not trying to lock them in a government cage as a punishment.
So I'd like to also drill down a little bit on the education issue. Most of educational decisions are made at the state and local level rather than the federal level, it seems.
Some are, yeah. A lot of them are.
So you're running for a federal office for president of the United States. To what extent would you have influence over educational the educational issue at the federal level? Where does the federal government touch education?
A pretty decent amount. So as a simple example, to draw a comparison between myself and Congressman Amash, Justin Amash voted because a lot of DC public school spending is influenced by at the federal level. Justin Amash voted to increase DC public school spending. DC public schools are overfunded. They are the most expensive schools in the country. They're also the worst performing public schools in the country. He voted to increase their spending. And that, again, that's a federal level thing, right? I would do the opposite. I would vote to get rid of all of their spending, all of their funding, because I think that literally any other option would be better than leaving kids trapped in such a terrible system, or for that matter, leaving teachers trapped in such a terrible system. A lot of those teachers are people who could be great teachers if they weren't hamstrung, if they didn't have their hands tied by such terrible curricula. The other thing that can happen at the federal level is getting rid of the Department of Education entirely. Things like Common Core and other toxic programs come from the federal level. And they're sort of, in one way or another, states are pressured into using those. So I would get rid of the Department of Education entirely. One of the nice benefits of getting rid of the Department of Education is it would also get rid of all subsidies for colleges. Today, colleges are just increasing their prices recklessly because they're getting these huge subsidies from the government. I would get rid of those subsidies and let colleges choose: lower your prices or go out of business.
So have you read Brian Kaplan's The Case Against Education? And well, first of all, have you read that?
I've read parts of it. I haven't read the whole thing, but yeah, I mean, when it came out, it was kind of, it made a pretty decent splash.
So do you agree with his central thesis that that there's too much education spending at the collegiate level, not too little, and that it should be taxed rather than subsidized if there's any government policy at all?
Well, I wouldn't tax it, and I wouldn't subsidize it either. The big part that I agreed with him on was that today colleges become primarily a signaling mechanism rather than an educational mechanism. In other words, it's become this like certificate of survival that lets employers know that you're willing to put up with nonsense for a few years. What I would want to see is more people become aware of the other options that exist right now. Just as you have homeschooling as an option to public school, and just as you can make that homeschooling competitive in college prep, and as we're doing with the AP homeschool project, showing people how to do that, you can do the same thing in a lot of ways in higher education. So there's two ways that I encourage people to consider alternatives to a traditional college-based higher education. The first is something that comes from the private sector. It's something called the actuarial exams. The exams are extremely hard, but passing just one of those massively increases your chance of employment in the financial sector, essentially for life. Now, those exams take about a year to study for. It's calculus-based probability, so it's not that it's that easy, but again, it carries more weight than a college degree in many circles. The second exam I want people to think about as an alternative. And remember, I'm not saying that only exams can be alternatives, a million different alternatives. But if you're looking for something that's more in that style, the second exam that I encourage people to think about comes actually from the government. The US government recognized that college degrees are unreliable. And so they know, and they don't want American diplomats embarrassing the United States. So they've created their own exam for people who want to be diplomats. The Foreign Service Officer Test, it's a great exam of general knowledge, current events, history, psychology, math. I mean, everything is on this exam. And again, it carries, in many circles, it carries more weight than a college degree. Obviously, if you want to be a diplomat, it clearly carries more weight. But even other circles, it's more respected because it's not like anyone can get it, right? It's hard to actually do. So those are some direction that I want to see more people start to consider. I'm not saying that college is wrong for everyone. It's probably wrong for most people, but there are probably some people where that's the thing, that's what they're actually looking for. But it's been sold as this thing that everyone should be doing, should be like a prerequisite for basic adulthood, and that's just not true. That's just totally wrong. And I want to see that change radically. And one way to begin that change is to end all government subsidies for higher education. By the way, of course, that would make college debt a thing of the past, because if college only costs $2,000 a year, it'd be pretty hard to get $100,000 in debt.
Have you sought the presidential nomination before or ran as a candidate for another office? If so, tell me about some of your earlier campaigns.
Sure. I've run as a candidate for other offices. This is my first time running for president. So the first time I ran for office, I ran for House of Delegates. And again, this is back when I was a very moderate minarchist.
House of Delegates in what state?
Oh, sorry, in Maryland, in Maryland. And this is back when I was a very moderate minarchist. And I heard something that was so I had a lot of, friends and campaign workers, family members working at the different polling stations, telling people about me as they went in to vote. And I found the most fascinating thing, Chuck, which is all my campaign material was very moderate, very inoffensive, right? But I had mentioned to a lot of people in my campaign that I would love to get rid of all the red light cameras, right? People had advised, say, like, stay away from that kind of stuff. There's no reason to, like, anger people, ruffle feathers, or any of that kind of stuff. But what I heard from so many of the people who were helping me at the polls was that when they mentioned that point to people who are going in to vote, people were like, oh, hell yeah. If that is what he's about, I'm definitely voting for him. And places where individual polling stations where people had been talking about that had significantly higher vote totals. Now, granted, they weren't still very high, but they were significantly higher percentage-wise than the other stations. What that showed me is that people are ready to be inspired, to be excited. They're not looking for the most inoffensive, invisible, easily dismissed candidate. They're looking for somebody whose positions are exciting, are different, might rub some people the wrong way, but will excite other people. And so that's been a major change. That was a major change in my own strategy, where I went from being very, very moderate to a lot less moderate. I've run for Congress. I've run for Senate. And each of those has been an amazing learning experience. I've gotten to debate people with more and more political experience. Probably at this point, the most sort of famous politician I've debated against was Lincoln Chafee, and I think I definitely held my own against him in Florida. So it's been this learning experience where I've gradually learned more and more about politics, about state politics, federal politics, national politics, and I think that training has really prepared me well for a lot of the stuff that I've experienced during this campaign.
When did you realize you were a libertarian?
I realized it twice. The first time I realized it kind of like the wrong way, the way a lot of people do. When I was 14, I told a friend of mine who was into politics that I really wanted to be part of a party that was like the Republicans on economics, but like the Democrats on social issues. And he said, "Oh, that's the Libertarian Party." And so for a long time, I was a libertarian. I consider myself a libertarian, but in a lot of ways, I was really a centrist. I wasn't about cutting and dismantling huge parts of government. I hadn't thought of things like that. I wasn't about abolishing government schools or ending the FDA or ending the Fed. I viewed all of those as necessary to a functioning economy. That changed over time, and so my second arrival to libertarianism, my second awakening, really happened when I saw when two things were happening at the same time. One was I was really starting to see how much damage public schools were doing to students. I was working with a lot of students in public schools, and I could see the damage that was being done. I could see that people were losing their confidence for no reason because their schools were just making idiotic curriculum decisions. I could see the toxic social environments that people were being exposed to, where people who were essentially trying to be good and decent were either being bullied or essentially just joining the other side and becoming degenerates. And I was seeing this happen before me time and time again. I was fighting it as much as I could using whatever limited influence I had as a mentor, but I was facing such a tidal wave of negative effects from government schools. At the same time, this was when the Wall Street bailout was happening. And I saw that this had nothing to do with economic benefit. It had nothing to do with necessity. It was basically, look, everyone's worrying. Let's hand money to our friends. And when I saw that happening, I realized that I could no longer stand on the sidelines, that I had to work to shut down not just the bailouts, but the mechanism that would allow something like that in the first place. So at the time, I joined an online group called Americans Against the Bailout. Clearly, as history shows, we weren't successful in stopping that bailout, but we did raise a lot of awareness. We had, by the start of it, we had maybe a few dozen members. We had tens of thousands by the end of it. And we were able to change, I think, quite a few hearts and minds, leading to some animosity towards the bailout. Over time, though, I realized it was more about addressing the underlying issue. The underlying issue was that a government that had that kind of power, both to hand money to their friends and to trick the American people into believing that was okay, was a problem. And that was where I saw this intersection, right, between government problems and educational problems. To me, a lack that if people were able to be tricked into that, that spoke to a lack of relevant and effective education. So I started working on different approaches to education, approaches that were designed to make people maybe a little bit more skeptical. I still believe that politics and education should never formally mix, but I do believe that education should prepare people to critically analyze politics, not just say, "Oh, the government said it, so it must be fine."
How long have you been a member of the Libertarian Party?
I registered to vote as a libertarian whenever I first registered to vote. I was a non-voter for many years, though. So I was registered, but I didn't do anything with my registration. Later on, I became more active, and my registration by then had expired. I was listed as unaffiliated. Um, and so I rejoined in between 2008, 2009, that time. I ran for office in 2010 because I was just gung ho out the door. I was really excited about this. And so that was when I joined the Libertarian Party as I registered Libertarian. Not too long thereafter, I registered as a member of the National Party, paid my dues and all that kind of stuff. And, from there, it's just grown.
Have you been active in your state and county affiliates?
I was for a long time. I was a member of the executive board in Maryland. Then when I was on the LNC, it just became really just too much to be on both. So while I still maintained my position on the Central Committee of the Libertarian Party of Maryland, I resigned from the board of the Libertarian Party of Maryland. I didn't resign; I actually just chose not to run again during the next cycle. And it kind of came to the same thing. I chose not to run for the next cycle because I just couldn't really adequately do both of those. Both of those require a lot of work. Our county party is fledgling. It's new. It's I haven't been very involved in it. Actually, just today on social media, was contacted by some of the folks from the county party, and they're looking to, make a big splash. And I think that's really good because my county happens to be largely inside the Beltway. So we are in the belly of the beast over here. I can't think of a better place to have an amazing, exciting, dynamic party than right here in the realm of the enemy.
You touched on this already, but I asked the same questions of everyone. So,
Sure.
have you served in any party leadership positions?
Yeah, I was representative at large for one term and vice chair of the Libertarian Party for 2 terms.
Do you vote Libertarian?
Yes, ever since I started voting again, I voted Libertarian. The exception to that, though, was in 2008. I was tricked. I thought that Obama was going to be different. In 2008, he spoke so openly about things. He talked about that he had used marijuana, that he had inhaled, and that was the whole point. Now, even though I don't personally use marijuana, I respected his honesty. And I foolishly thought at the time that meant he would then work to end the war on drugs. In reality, he just increased it. And so I felt in that sense that I had made a mistake, right? I'd voted for the wrong person. And, arguably even worse, I'd encouraged many, many other people to do that. While I didn't have, the same political reach that I do now, I still had a decent number of people who took my advice with some level of seriousness. So I felt that I'd done something wrong over there, and that it was incumbent on me to try to work to correct that. So even in 2008, I still considered myself a libertarian. And for everyone else on the ballot, I voted libertarian. I didn't vote for any other Democrats, but I voted for Obama because I got tricked. So what I do now a lot is I encourage people to try to not get tricked. One of the things that I've talked about with a lot of people in a lot of different state chairs was the way that we got tricked in 2016 by Bill Weld. He apologized to us for his assault weapons ban. And that's the trick. He apologized to us, to a small closed room of a few hundred people. We should have insisted that he apologized in the biggest media he could find, New York Times, CNN, whatever, that the assault weapons ban was wrong. He wants to repeal all assault weapons ban and get rid of all gun laws. That's what we should have insisted on, but we were naive and we got tricked by that. Of course, Bill Weld, what he did when he did get the major media was basically endorse Hillary. And when he was speaking about guns, said that anyone on a watch list should lose their Second Amendment rights. And that to me is partially his fault for tricking us, and partially our fault for getting tricked. We are supposed to be vetting people, and we failed in our job of vetting people. So today I tell people, whatever candidate you want to nominate, make sure that if there's something in that person's path that you think is wrong, don't accept just an apology to you. That's not enough. Expect that apology should be in the New York Times or CNN or whatever the biggest media they can get. If they're not super famous and the biggest media they can get is their own Facebook page, the biggest media they can get. With Congressman Amash, I've said really clearly, he's a likable guy. I like him. He's a great public speaker, an amazing public speaker. And so he has all those niceties. And yet it's really hard for me to be willing to support somebody that has called for an increase in Medicaid in Reason magazine, like the most libertarian friendly, big magazine anywhere, called for an increase in Medicaid, who's voted to increase public school spendings. To me, that's a problem. Now, if that's just something he feels that was a mistake, fine, you can make a mistake. I've made many mistakes, but I would expect an apology, not to a closed group of libertarians, but in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, on CNN. That to me is what an actual political apology looks like, something that binds you to change in the view of the entire public, not just some whispered apology to a small group of people.
What if you were elected president, but Congress was solidly Republican or Democrat? Would you be able to enact and implement your agenda with an obstructionist Congress? How would you work with or around those who disagree with you?
I mean, you guys, I don't know. I know that you watch the LNC meetings pretty closely, but I mean, I have no problem going around I have no problem in violating the spirit of something while staying within the letter. And, the obstructionist Congress is going to get an obstructionist and monkey wrenching president. If they won't let me get rid of the FDA, for example, I will just use whatever executive power I can to hamstring the FDA so they can't do anything. If they keep on with the laws that say if you're a foreign doctor, you can't practice medicine in the United States, which, by the way, is one of the causes of our current medical shortages. If they want to keep trying to force that law, I'll simply refuse to enforce the law and also pardon anyone who is arrested for practicing medicine without having gotten an American residency. I believe that the best doctor in Switzerland has every right to practice medicine in the United States, and that American people have the right to get the treatment from the best doctor in Switzerland here in America. I don't think that sick people should have to travel to Switzerland or Japan or Germany or wherever the expert is over there. Listen, we are the richest, most prosperous, and one of the freest countries on earth. There's a line around the world of people who want to come here. If we welcome the best doctors all over the world to here and say you don't need to redo your residency. By the way, Chuck, the current law is if you want to practice medicine in America, you have to redo your residency. But that's not all. If you're a foreign doctor, it's nearly impossible to get a residency in any kind of a specialty. So they've made it nearly impossible for those people to ever practice medicine here. If the Congress doesn't want to legalize drugs, that's fine, but I'm going to pardon every single person for any drug crime of any kind constantly. I'll just sit there and pardon people all day. If Congress wants to declare some sort of a pointless war on a pointless war on everybody at all times, I'm just going to bring the troops home. As commander in chief, I'm not going to allow the troops to participate in anything that insane. So I will use every presidential power against Congress. The nice thing about the Constitution is that it's actually designed to make it harder to do something than to not do something. Now, today, things have been turned around because Congress and the president are both trying to do more stuff. But if your goal is to try to make government do less, it's constitutionally much easier to do that than to make government do more. And I'll use every executive power, every power of the pardon. If I need to do a made-up Trump-style emergency to get stuff done, I'm happy to do that. My goal is to get government out of your life, to get government out of your wallet, to bring freedom back to America. I'm not very particular on how I do it.
So, quick question from the chat. Do you need a USA given license to practice medicine in the USA?
Yes, and it's not just U.S. Often you need a state license. So, for example, if you're like on the border between, one state and another, often you can't practice medicine across the state lines. That's how insane this has gotten. And this is not about protecting you. It's not about keeping you safe at all. Here's my proof. In America, nurse practitioners can practice medicine, but the best doctor in all of Switzerland can't. This is not to say anything against nurse practitioners practicing medicine. I think it's a great idea. But the idea that the worst nurse practitioner in America is more qualified than the best doctor in Switzerland is laughable. And so I want to get rid of that. And I want to say this: as an adult, you can go to whatever doctor you want to. If you don't like that doctor, don't go again. Go to a different doctor. If you're not sure if you can trust that doctor or not, read his reviews, ask his colleagues, ask his peers, ask his other patients. There are ways to get information. Right now, most of us do that when we pick a doctor. Most people don't just randomly choose a doctor. I mean, maybe some do, but most people don't just randomly pick a doctor. You ask for recommendations. You look at their reviews. You look at their website and see if they look competent. I mean, you do things. And that's not going to change. You're going to use that same level of care and concern, even if the doctor's been trained in Switzerland rather than in America.
What are President Trump's best and worst executive accomplishments?
Some of his better ones have been things that involve stripping away regulations. He has removed some regulations. He's talked about getting us out of WHO. I'm not sure if that's materialized or if it's ever going to, but it's a good idea. Some of his worst executive decisions that are purely executive, and these are things that even a libertarian president will have to deal with, is some of his bad leadership in responding to the crisis. Listen, anyone who has the basic, most minuscule knowledge of foreign policy knows that the Chinese government has historically been lying to us about a lot of things. They've clearly lied about ages of Olympic athletes, and that's the highest level of scrutiny. They lie in order to save face. They lie for their public image. They lie just because they want to lie for whatever reason, but they've lied a lot. And for an American president to be so gullible as to believe the numbers coming out of China, to me, is a failure in leadership. Other decisions that he's made that are wrong have been decisions as commander in chief. What he should have done is brought all the troops home on day one. Instead, he has continued a lot of these failed, endless, pointless wars. And what's even worse than continuing a failed war is continued a war that's already been successfully completed. You know, the supposed reason to go into Iraq and Afghanistan was to kill Osama bin Laden. I think it's bizarre military tactics to send a giant infantry, a huge amount of infantry and Navy and Air Force to kill one guy. But at the end of it, it worked. Now it's time to come home. It was a strange, expensive, bizarre way to accomplish the mission. The mission was accomplished. And once you finish a thing, you don't need to keep doing it. As president, I will bring all the troops home on day one. I will shut down foreign military bases on day one. I will give early honorable discharges on day one. And we will never again be involved in anybody else's civil war.
That brings me to my next question. Tell us what you would do in your first 100 days in office if elected president.
I mean, there's so much that happens on day one, it's almost hard to think past it. But I will talk about what I'll do in those first 100 days, starting with day one. Day one, pardons. Day one, shutting down foreign military bases and bringing the troops home. The next items on the agenda are to get rid of most or all federal agencies. The FDA has to go. It is killing Americans. Because the FDA has driven up the cost of drug approval, of drug production so high, today, if you have a rare disease, there's almost no chance you'll ever see a cure. Not because a cure doesn't exist. Often the cures already exist. They're sitting on lab benches waiting. But because the approval process is so expensive, companies just can't break even on it. So they never go to that final phase, that most expensive phase. The FDA also needs to go because it is preventing America from bringing medicines in from overseas. Listen, if you were a country engaged in a unscrupulous, immoral, insane war, you didn't care how you won the war, you just wanted to hurt the other side, and you had no morality at all, here's what you might do. You might block medical supplies from that country. That would be in violation of all international accords, of all levels of morality, of all traditions in war since the beginning of wars. But that's what you would do if you simply didn't care about any of that. Here's what's interesting. What we wouldn't do to our worst enemy in times of war is what the US government is doing to us in times of peace. It is blocking the doctors from coming here. It is blocking medical supplies from coming to the United States. So I'm going to stop that by getting rid of all government involvement in healthcare. I'm going to be getting rid of organizations like the TSA, the Department of Homeland Security, the redundant spy agencies. Listen, we don't need 18 spy agencies. one small constitutionally limited intelligence agency at most is what we need. We might not even need that. Militarily, my goal is to keep America safe at the lowest possible cost. I'm not running for president of France or president of Israel or president of Saudi Arabia or president of any other country. It is not my job to provide their defense. And I don't want to steal American money to provide for their defense. I want to provide American defense at the lowest cost possible. So a big part of my plan is to end all foreign aid, all foreign financial aid, all foreign military aid. My goal is to end most or all parts of the federal government and then stay on essentially as a partner in chief, and to make sure to use whatever executive powers that I need to make sure that Congress does not find some other way to infringe on freedom. I'll be there just protecting freedom through vetoes, executive orders, pardons, you name it. That's my job. And that's going to be my first day, my first 100 days, and my entire term.
How would a libertarian president have dealt with the coronavirus?
You know, a lot of the things that governors were doing were actually kind of libertarian things, not the mandated. And Chuck, I do have a big problem with the use of the word quarantine. People have been calling this a quarantine, and that's not what a quarantine is. A quarantine is when you put sick people in a separate area. If you're well and you're being quarantined, you're not being quarantined, you're under house arrest without trial. So that part is not libertarian, but a lot of the other things have been libertarian. States have been allowing doctors who are retired to start practicing medicine without having to renew their licenses. They've been allowing foreign trained doctors to practice medicine. See, that stupid nonsense crony capitalism goes out the window when lives are at stake. So in a lot of ways, there'd be some similarities. I would have preemptively allowed foreign doctors to practice medicine over here, and they're doing it after the fact, but there is that similarity. But this actually goes much deeper. I want to ask you and the audience to think about this. What is the longest you can imagine waiting in line at a restaurant? Suppose it's like the busiest day of the year, the most popular restaurant in the whole city, whichever city you live in. What's the longest you can imagine waiting in line? What, 2 hours, 3 hours, maybe 5 hours? That's the longest, right? Now ask yourself, what's the shortest you can imagine waiting in a hospital? Well, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 hours. It's about the same. And that's not because medical care is fundamentally slower or something like that. If anything, if you've ever seen the speed at which the average waiter moves and the speed at which the average trauma nurse moves, the trauma nurses move a lot quicker. They run, and even the most diligent waiter they're not usually sprinting around the restaurant, right? The reason for that is because hospitals in most states are required to get what's called a certificate of need. And when I learned about this, I was, even as cynical as I am, I was shocked. Here's what a certificate of need is. You have to get another hospital in that area to, like, your competitor, right, to endorse you for setting up a new hospital. And of course, hospitals were like, no, we don't want the competition. We'd rather keep giving subadequate service. So today we have a shortage of hospitals, right? That's what we're worried about, a shortage of hospital beds. But why? We don't have a shortage of restaurants on the busiest day of the year. When everyone's trying to go to a restaurant, everyone can still go to a restaurant. Why isn't it the same with hospitals? Why, if everyone wants to go to a hospital, cannot everyone go to a hospital? The answer is government has artificially restricted the number of hospitals to financially benefit entrenched hospitals, the people who are funding their campaigns. What I would have done as a libertarian president is just to put an end to that. I would make it absolutely used any method at my disposal to allow people to build as many hospitals as they want to. And if your hospital is not very good and nobody comes to it, well, that's your problem. But if your hospital is better and you take all the clients from the rival hospital, great, that's their problem. And that's their incentive to start to do a little bit better. So the way that we would respond to the crisis, the way I would respond to the crisis, is by using the free market. By saying, yeah, foreign doctors, come on over. Yeah, buy medicines from overseas. Build as many hospitals as you like. You want to build 50 hospitals? You want to have as many hospitals as we have Starbucks? Great. Build as many hospitals as you can. That is what a libertarian solution would be. And that free market would give us the level of access, the level of care, and the level of medical equipment that we actually need.
So we're broadcasting right now on a gaming website. Mm-hmm. Tell me about your hobbies. Do you play any video games or board games or card games?
So I was a big fan. I still am a big fan of video games, but I was one of those people who's kind of a little bit too much of a fan of video games, if you catch my drift. So in my early 20s, as much as I love playing video games, I love coming home. And this is around the time that Halo 2 had just come out. I love coming home from work and playing Halo 2, for what I would tell myself was going to be 45 minutes and what would actually be about, 9.5 hours. I love that. I still love video games. And, I love keeping track of all the innovations going on in video games. But it's one of those things that I have to be a little bit cautious about. It is something that is a major temptation for me. I love them a little bit too much sometimes. So I don't play that many video games now, not because I don't want to, but because I want to do a lot of other things with the amount of time that I might get sucked into there. After I put my video games down, and for me, I actually had to just donate or give away all my gaming consoles and everything. That was when I wrote my first book, The Equation for Excellence, which was then later published in China. So I found that for me, I was just more productive when I didn't have a lot of games going on. More recently, though, in business, we've started to look at ways in which some of the innovations in both board games and in computer games could be applied in various ways to our particular model of education. Now, that's in the really early stages, but it is an exciting time. Now, I want to ask a lot of people who are watching this, think about the amount of innovation that you see in just video games. That's not the whole tech sector, right? That's just a little piece of the tech sector. Think about how many great new ideas are coming out all the time, constant innovations, new upgrades, new updates, all that kind of stuff, new gaming systems entirely. And imagine if that kind of energy and passion and excitement that we see in the world of video games right now was also happening in the world of education. That's what we could have if we got rid of government schools. We could make education as exciting as, or even more exciting than what's happening in the video game world. And that's what I'm fighting for. That's why I want to abolish government schools. It's not that I just hate education. I love education, but I want education to be as exciting as the world of video games, not as painful as the current world of education.
So, on the subject of video games, you said you were a fan of Halo back in the day. Do you think video games cause violence?
No. I mean, when you look at violence, you look at there's two very distinct types of violence, and I've written about this issue in a few other areas, but there are two very different types of violence. One type is the sort of impulse control violence, usually people of nutritional deficiencies, cognitive impairment, things like that. But a lot of the violence that we're seeing now, especially sexual violence, has become very predatory. And so that's not coming from people who can't tell the difference between reality and fiction. It's coming from people who are coldly preying on other people. And so a lot of what I've done in that area, in the area of violence prevention, is shared a lot of my experience. I've worked as a counselor. I've worked as an educator for many years. I've been there to help people who have been through a lot of these terrible experiences. And so what I've tried to do, and there's an article that I posted on that actually I didn't post on Medium, that Alex Merced posted, an article of mine that Alex Merced posted on medium.com, where I say, here are the things that people are doing. Here's how you can start to protect yourselves from them. And the key part of that is, what we've seen with sexual violence, with the Me Too movement, is that government has entirely failed to protect us from what in my opinion is one of the worst types of crime, right? The government has failed to protect us. And so this is on us to find different innovative solutions to protect ourselves, protect our loved ones, and protect each other from this kind of violence. Government's not going to end it. We have to do it. But in terms of does that come from playing video games? I mean, I think that's kind of nonsense. I don't think that argument holds water at all.
What are your campaign's target demographics? Would your outreach lean conservative, liberal, or to some other direction?
So there's a lot of specific pockets that we're looking at. So, I mean, one big group, of course, is people who are very passionate about education. That's people who are engaged in homeschooling, unschooling, other forms of educational innovation. They really respond to our message. Doctors, that's another big one, because we've spoken out for a long time. I've spoken out for a long time against the American Medical Association. I've talked about how they are restricting the supply of doctors to drive up the price of doctors, and that hurts. That hurts everyone. I mean, it hurts patients, right? It makes us have to pay more for no reason. There's no reason that healthcare should be so expensive. It wasn't always. In the 1950s, normal people could afford to have doctors come to their house. And today, despite the advances of in technology, normal people can no longer afford that. And that's backwards. That shouldn't be the case. And that's an effect of government interfering with the market. Now, today, the American Medical Association's poorly thought out long-term strategy has actually hurt doctors. Medical spending right now is down 18%. And if you look at just the people that do more elective type things, spine surgeons, plastic surgeons, etc. And when I say elective, I don't mean insignificant. If you're dealing with crippling back pain, that's not insignificant, but often the surgery is elective. So those people are not able to do their surgeries. Those people, the patients are often in very debilitating levels of pain or facing other major difficulties. The AMA, by monkeying with the medical marketplace, is hurting them. So not only is it morally wrong, which I think that most people at some level already kind of figured out, most doctors kind of figured out, it's financially wrong. It's financially hurting them. So I want to talk. So that's become a major area of outreach to us. We've been talking to various doctors individually, medical organizations more broadly, to try to get that idea out there that libertarianism is better for healthcare providers as well. In terms of overall demographics, though, it's one of those things where I've spoken at so many different types of groups, Chuck. I've spoken at groups where basically everyone is a hardcore, like super hardcore left wing. I've spoken in groups where everybody's like hyper conservative, hyper religious even. And what I've seen is there's no real way to predict it. The truth, it just goes out into the darkness. And some people respond to it in any group. I've talked to people who, after I've presented, have said, I've thought my whole life that my only choice was to be a liberal Democrat. I thought that was the only moral thing I could do. And this is the first time I've ever thought about anything different. And there's no reason, logically, there'd be no reason to target that person, right? Because you'd say, like, here's a group of people who are at a Democratic political event. They're committed, hardcore liberal Democrats. Why waste your time? And the way I see it is I'm going to waste my time, as people say, absolutely anywhere. And I've made it clear that I will bring my message to literally anybody who's willing to listen to me. I've spoken to groups that I have, some pretty significant moral opposition to, not just political opposition. I mean, as you can see, I'm not white, but I've spoken on white supremacist radio because I want to bring the message of libertarianism to everybody. Did it reach everybody? I don't know, but I will tell you this. When I was last at the Libertarian Convention in 2016, somebody showed me a tattoo they had that had been removed, but you could see the outline of it, right? It was the outline of a Nazi swastika that he'd removed. And he says, here's where I was. This is what I thought was right. This is what I was doing. And somebody awakened me. And and this is when I got in some controversy for being on Aryan radio in the first place. He said, somebody awakened me. And so I want to thank you, because if somebody had not reached out to me in the darkness, if somebody had not reached out to me when I was in the worst place of my life, then I would have still been there. And so I think that's the key. All of us find ourselves trapped in problematic ways of thinking from time to time, and there's nobody who I'm not trying to reach out to.
So you've talked about this issue a little bit, but I would see if you want to expand on it a little bit. What should government do about healthcare?
The government should get out of healthcare. We're living in an information age where you can look at like 5,000 reviews of any doctor. The doctors are living in an information age where they can see the results of different medical trials, where they can instantly contact their own peers or experts or consultants. The people often say, well, we need to have an FDA to approve drugs, and we don't. And here's my absolute proof that we just don't need the FDA anymore. Today, doctors often prescribe medicines for off-label uses. Here's what that means. The medicine is approved for one thing by the FDA, and the doctor prescribes it for something entirely else. No relationship whatsoever to the original thing. And we trust doctors to do that because they're experts, and they look at journals, and they talk to their peers, and they talk to consultants. That, to me, is a doctor operating entirely without any input from the FDA. And this is a very common thing. Off-label use is not a rare thing. It's ubiquitous in the medical industry. The FDA is nothing but economic friction. So I would get rid of it entirely. I would get rid of all government involvement in healthcare. I would get rid of Medicare and Medicaid and all of it. And this again is a striking difference between me and Congressman Amash. Congressman Amash has called for an increase in Medicaid. I'm calling for its abolition, as well as the abolition of all other government involvement in medicine.
When you talked about off-label usage, it seems to me that the FDA is supposedly warranting two things. Number one, safety, and number two, efficacy. So if doctors are prescribing for off-label, they're prescribing for something that there's no warrant for efficacy because that hasn't been stamped by the FDA. But there still is that warrant of safety where the FDA is saying, well, this isn't going to kill you if you take it. So do you think people could still, without the FDA doing that, know that these drugs are safe?
Sure. I mean, the same way that you know your makeup is safe. I mean, you try a lot of different things that are not FDA approved, and you can know that they're safe. And here's what corrects that. The free market corrects that. And I don't mean, it's often presented like the free market will correct it, whereas if you believe the wrong person, you die or something like that. That's not what I mean. Whenever you're buying anything, and I'm not talking about something for health, I'm saying when you're buying anything, you're buying a new hard drive, you look at 457 reviews. If you have friends who are experts in the area, you say like, hey, what's a good kind of hard drive to get? And a hard drive compared to your health is insignificant. Now a doctor who is prescribing a medicine, I mean, right now, I come from a medical family. My mom's a doctor. There's plenty of medicines that are FDA approved that my mom simply refuses to prescribe because she thinks they're dangerous. And that's not because the FDA thinks they're dangerous, because she thinks they're dangerous, because she's either seen them in action or talked to other people or read peer-reviewed journals or taken other steps, because her goal is her patient safety, both for financial reasons, but also for just basic moral reasons. Nobody becomes a doctor because they're trying to poison people, right? And so there are other ways to have that safety check than have the FDA do a safety test. There are many other ways to test for safety. Here's one step though. A lot of people have said, well, would you be okay with an intermediate step? Sure. If the FDA removed the efficacy requirement, that's a great step. I would want some much bigger steps, but that would be a step in the right direction. Having an efficacy requirement is just bizarre. There's no reason for it. It's not being used. It's not being taken seriously at all. But even with the safety requirement, that's something that can be easily handled outside of the FDA using maybe a model similar to what we have for electronics, Underwriter Laboratories and whatnot that looks at safety, at the safety of other things that could also be a problem. We could have something very similar to that, a free market approach to medical safety.
So I have two questions from the audience related to healthcare, so we might as well handle them right now. The first, I'll just give you both of them and let you comment on them. The first is, should healthcare access be rationed by an individual's wealth level? And the second one is, what are your thoughts on Obamacare?
Should it be rationed by wealth level? So, that to me is kind of a very crude misrepresentation of should people pay for healthcare. And what rationed by wealth level would mean, and I don't think this is what the person's asking, but here's what it would look like, which is that if you decide, let's say you're going to decide who gets a medicine, you look at their bank account and say, you have the highest bank account, so you get this medicine. That's what rationing based on wealth would be. Now, when people say rationing based on wealth, what they mean is, should people pay for medicine? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. If you look at areas where healthcare is, to use the quote, rationed by wealth level, or to use my phrasing, paid for, what you see is that healthcare is actually usually much cheaper. Compare, for example, EpiPen to LASIK. EpiPen is like 1910s technology, and it's adrenaline inside of a syringe, and there's nothing terribly advanced over there. Compare that to LASIK, and also EpiPen is not even delivered by a skilled person. You give it to yourself, right? Or if you have a child, you give it to your own child. It's not like a doctor administers it. Now compare that to LASIK. LASIK is like science fiction level technology, and it's given to you by a highly skilled professional. Because of government involvement and because it's covered by insurance and whatnot, EpiPen's cost has gone from about $100 to a few $100s. LASIK, on the other hand, has gone from a cost of tens of thousands of dollars per eye to a few $100s per eye. Price pressure is essential to making anything cheaper. And when you see a little bit of free market, as you see with LASIK, that price pressure, that price competition forces the price down. When you don't have that competition, the price goes up to whatever the government's willing to tolerate. What the government's willing to tolerate is usually dictated by who's donating to how much to which campaign. We can have that across the board. And you see that happens not just, by the way, in healthcare, it happens in education. Because the government is willing to subsidize college education, its price is skyrocketed. If you simply got government out of that, the price would have to go down. In private sector education, that's supposedly so much more expensive, the price is a lot cheaper. If you look at the hourly cost of attending a private college, it's over $100 an hour to sit and lecture. And when people say, look at all these rich people with their expensive tutors, I mean, expensive tutors is maybe $100 an hour, but not for a lecture. That's for one-on-one tutoring. Colleges are literally charging $100 an hour to sit in lectures because they can get away with it. If you got rid of all that, had people actually looking at the prices, had price competition, you force down the prices, making things actually affordable. If you have price competition, everyone can afford something. If you don't have price competition, no one can afford it.
But the second question there was, what are your thoughts on Obamacare? Do you feel you've addressed that, or do you want to address that?
No, that's actually good. I would want to address that a little bit more. I would repeal it entirely. It's just a terrible system. It is expensive. It's burdensome. It is not insurance. A lot of it's wealth redistribution. Insurance is designed to protect you against risk. That's what it's for. It's not an alternative way to pay for something. Now, listen, insurance companies want insurance to pay for doctors' visits. Why? Because doctors' visits, so your basic checkup, is the most common thing that people do, and the insurance wants to get its 15%. Remember, I actually used to work as an insurance actuary, so this is not just stuff I'm making up. I'm telling you, as an actuary, you want, if you're getting a fixed percentage, you want to get a fixed percentage of the most common things. And of course, you want a fixed percentage of the most expensive things. A true insurance in healthcare would look something like this. You would just have insurance like car insurance to cover you against the most catastrophic and expensive things. Car insurance doesn't cover your gasoline. It doesn't cover basic maintenance. It only covers the unexpected. And if healthcare only covered the unexpected for you, then it would be affordable for you. Obamacare largely moves money from the young to the old. And what that means is younger people are now having a harder time starting families, getting started with life, because they're paying with their lower, their starting salaries are usually lower than somebody who's 60 that's been working for a long time. With their lower salaries are being forced to subsidize the healthcare of people who are much older. People who are in their 50s and 60s are paying less. People in their 20s and 30s are paying more. And that's just wrong. I mean, that's just wealth redistribution in a bizarre direction. What I would do is get the government completely out of healthcare. And I would further encourage people to start looking at insurance as insurance to cover unexpected catastrophes. And say, instead of paying everything through insurance, pay most of your stuff out of pocket, all the normal stuff out of pocket, and then just use insurance to cover the truly expensive and unexpected costs.
Tell us about your foreign policy.
So there are, the simple answer, people always say libertarians don't have a foreign policy. I don't agree with that entirely. To me, there should be little to no foreign military policy. I don't believe we should ever be involved in somebody else's civil war ever again. And so I would shut down foreign military bases, bring the troops home, cut taxes accordingly, leave NATO, get out of any other military alliance, get out of the UN. So I think in that sense, there should be no military foreign policy, ending all foreign aid, ending all foreign military aid, and all other types of foreign aid. But it goes further than, but there is a further aspect, which is I do believe that a leader of any movement, of any country, to me as a leader inside of my own business, I think this is part of my job, is to provide guidance to people who are looking to you for guidance. During this coronavirus outbreak, I did my best to provide guidance to people because of my, a lot of my work is international, and I've traveled quite a bit, and I have a lot of friends in different countries. I did my best to try to share that information. I tried to share the fact that the information coming out of China was false. I try to share the fact that the information coming out of India was false. And I try to explain why. I talked about China briefly already. In India, healthcare is largely paid for out of pocket. So autopsies are like never done. I mean, rarely to never. What that means is that if somebody dies unexpectedly, it's just sort of blanket categorized as a heart attack. And so the numbers coming out of the two most populous countries on earth, China and India, is just wrong. It's just wrong data. And then, of course, what later happened in India is they've been trying to find a way to blame it on Muslims, to like go on with their nonsense religious warfare and whatnot. And they've been trying to do all the kind of stuff you expect. China is trying to suggest that the spread of coronavirus is somehow America's fault, that it went from Wuhan to Cleveland to Beijing, not just like Wuhan to Beijing, which would actually make any sense. So we're seeing the predictable after effects. As president, I would do the same thing. If I saw, and that's just as a person, right? If I saw that a foreign country was clearly misleading people, I would say this country is clearly misleading people. The extent to which the U.S. diplomacy has gotten in the way of truth, though, can really best be seen with Taiwan. Diplomatically, the United States essentially pretends that Taiwan doesn't exist because they're so afraid of antagonizing China. I don't think that's a good diplomatic strategy, and I also don't think it makes sense. I mean, I don't think it's good to pretend that a major democratic capitalist country is somebody's imagination. It's there. I have friends that live there. I have more friends that have visited there. It's not pretend. So that to me is what I would do. The diplomatic part of it would be about sharing my insights when I think that people are lying or misleading.
So, as president, what is the proper constitutional role of executive orders? What would you accomplish with executive orders, if anything?
I mean, a lot of it would be repealing executive orders. A lot of it would be just getting rid of executive orders that were problematic and getting rid of them. I could see myself using executive orders designed to either get rid of an agency or to prevent it from doing any damage. So that's how I would use executive orders. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of them. I do think you open a dangerous door when you make too many things based on executive orders, but mostly I would be repealing ones that exist right now. I would also probably be using executive orders to get rid of or halt things like the Firearms Act and all that, because I do believe that the president can do a lot to protect freedom, but I would certainly never use it to restrict freedom or to increase taxes anyway. And I would use them to increase freedom and to decrease taxes.
What would you do about climate change?
That's a really important question for libertarians, because when we talk about climate change, we have to recognize that we're not talking about the climate change just in Washington, D.C., right? Or just in Nebraska. This is a worldwide phenomenon we're trying to address. So there's a few things that I would do. And the biggest one is to repeal the kind of affirmative action laws that are kind of keeping green energy down. Today, we all use green energy. If you have a cell phone, you're using green energy. You're using a low-powered screen. Now imagine for a moment, Chuck, if we told everyone in the world that you can no longer use the green, low-powered screen, but you had to use a 1980s-style CRT screen on your cell phone. No one would listen to it. People would revolt. They would hide their cell phones and absolutely not follow that. That's what we need in green energy. We need energy that can actually compete. See, there's no set of treaties, no set of bribery that's going to get people all over the world to actually use a green energy unless that green energy is in some other way better and more convenient. And it's our job, it's the job of innovators to find ways to make green energy better and more convenient. Low power screens, longer lasting LED bulbs, those all have advantages other than simply being green. LED bulbs, for example, last longer and they can be brighter. And that right there is a selling point to people who don't care that much about the environment or don't believe in climate change or whatever. In doing that, we can massively, massively change things. But there's a separate piece that I want to bring up here it's close to climate change, which is if you ask air quality experts, what's the real danger? They're all going to say the same thing. It's not the gaseous emissions, it's the particulate emissions that come largely from driving and things like that. And we can do something right now. We're seeing we can do something right now to change that. The two things we can do to radically improve air quality all over the world are telework and homeschool. If you're a business owner, I strongly advise you to find ways to looking into doing more telework. Right now we're doing it out of necessity, but through telework, a lot of good things come that people don't realize. First, it makes you be more innovative, and there is some upfront costs. My company, we switched to telework a few years ago, and yeah, we had to learn how to do a lot of things. We tried about 5,000 different technologies, and we experimented, and we made mistakes. But there are a few things that are big benefits, and these benefits are so valuable economically that I advise every business owner in the world to take these ones really seriously. You have people who are hardworking, you have people who are lazy. And when lazy people are in an office, they'll usually do about 75% as much as someone who's hardworking is doing. They'll pace themselves to that, right? But when everybody's at home, you start to see really big differences. The people who are hardworking will produce 10 times as much as the people who are lazy, because the people who are lazy don't have anyone to kind of peg their productivity to. That lets you know exactly who to keep and who to fire, or exactly who to retrain if you want to be more humanitarian about it. Telework is a huge benefit to any business that can telework. Now, I know that right now construction can't telework. I'm not saying every business can do it, but if you can do it, do it. The other one, homeschool. If you are looking for an advantage for Ivy League type admissions, or other competitive admissions, combined medical programs and whatnot, the best thing you can do just from an academic strategy perspective is homeschool. You can do so much more. If you want to learn about that, you can check out the new website from my campaign and business called aphomeschool.com. We show you exactly what to do to create a competitive college prep homeschooling program that's going to be far ahead of anything you'll find at Exeter, Andover, La Rose, Stuyvesant, any of the most competitive schools in the world. And how do we know? Well, because we work with students from the most competitive schools all over the world, and we know exactly what you need to do to beat them. We're telling you, we're giving you that insider information. It's completely free. It's our way of showing you that there are more options. Through teleworking and homeschooling, we can massively increase air quality in America, and we can increase air quality all over the world. But there's a second piece that a lot of people have started to realize. If we're teleworking and homeschooling, you can telework and homeschool from anywhere. And what this does is it essentially makes countries have to compete with each other. If every country knows that all of their citizens could pack up and leave anytime and do their teleworking and homeschooling from somewhere else, they're going to try to lower taxes. They're going to try to increase freedom. They're going to try to do their stuff better. We already saw that after Brexit. After Brexit was announced, years before anything actually happened, immediately Britain cut taxes and regulations. But more interestingly, socialist France cut taxes and regulations. That competition, just the threat of competition, is enough to bring governments in line.
What kind of judges would you appoint at the Supreme Court, the Circuit Court, and the Federal District Court level? Do you have a short list for the U.S. Supreme Court?
I mean, I think that like most libertarian candidates, Judge Napolitano is pretty much the top of my list. So I think that's not really going to differentiate me from any of the other libertarian candidates. But here's what I'm looking for in a judge. I'm looking for somebody who is committed to freedom, who is committed to individual liberty. I want somebody that has a broad view of the Constitution. In other words, I want them to understand, for example, that freedom of the press came from jury nullification. And that if you believe in freedom of the press, at some level, you also believe in jury nullification. I want somebody that's going to strictly interpret the Fourth Amendment and all the other amendments. I want somebody who's going to work to protect privacy and say, look at things like the Patriot Act and say, yeah, that's unconstitutional. That the Fourth Amendment, which says that you need to have a warrant to specifically search a specific person in a specific place, that's what you need to have to search somebody. And that simply stepping into an airport is not probable cause for a complete body search of a person. So there are a lot of things like that I want to see. So essentially, I'm looking for judges that will adhere to the Constitution exactly, and also have a broad view of the underlying principles that led to the Constitution. And one of those absolutely is jury nullification.
How should we handle the debt crisis?
So let's talk about what debt is, because a lot of times people don't, to them, debt is this weird abstract thing that happens. You know, a lot of people imagine the government wandering over to like a bank and taking out a loan. And then if they don't pay it back, then the bank sends somebody to get it from them. That's not what government debt is. I mean, government debt is savings bonds, treasury bills, treasury bonds. So you don't have to buy a savings bond. No one's making you do it. And when you buy a treasury bill, when you buy a treasury bond, you are investing in the war on drugs. You are investing in foreign wars. You are investing in every evil thing the US government did. You are buying a stock in the war on terror. You are buying a stock in the war on sex work. That's what a bond is. And so I don't have any particular sympathy for people who bought bonds. If you invest in an immoral company, sometimes you lose your money. Sometimes you don't, but sometimes you do. So to me, yes, there are ways to get rid of the debt that don't involve repudiating it, but I'm also completely open to repudiating the debt. Here are some other ways to do it, though, since a lot of people want to know what are the more friendly ways to do it. And there are more friendly ways to do it. And that is where I would start. Repudiating the debt is not my plan A, but it's also not something that I think is morally wrong. I think that buying a bond in an immoral government is morally questionable. I mean, it's no different than buying a bond buying a stock in a weapons contractor. It's the exact same thing to me. So here's some other things that we could do. The first is getting rid of the spending, right? The second is the government right now has some very valuable assets. Top of that list is sovereign territory. We remember from history class the Louisiana Purchase, the Gadsden Purchase, all that, where the U.S. bought sovereign territory from other countries. Well, the U.S. could sell small amounts of sovereign territory to private individuals. The value of that kind of sovereign territory would be astronomical and could easily be used to pay off the debt. If somebody had a square mile where they could set their own laws and taxes inside the United States, the value of that is incalculable. So one, they can sell sovereign territory and use that to pay down the debt. If they don't want to sell sovereign territory, they can just sell land. I mean, the U.S. has plenty of land that they can sell. Sovereign territory, though, to me is the best option because it creates internal competition. If you have, let's say, right down the street from you, there were 3 other countries, they all had lower taxes and better services, then you might leave and say, listen, I'm not going to be a citizen of the United States. I'm going to be a citizen of Chuck Moulton land because I just like it there better and they're offering me a better option. So there are many, many advantages that come from selling sovereign territory. The big thing, though, is ending the spending, getting rid of all the government spending on things where the spending is neither necessary nor beneficial. War on drugs is an example. Foreign wars, that's an example. A lot of the welfare programs we have today are examples where we're spending money to do damage.
Thank you. So Republicans and Democrats have a large pool to tap to fill the executive branch with appointees. How would you staff your departments? Do you have anyone in particular in mind for the cabinet level positions?
I do have a few people, but I mean the Libertarian Brain Trust is massive. I don't think we have any shortage of very skilled people or very, very knowledgeable people who would understand the workings of the system, both in the legal sense and in the freedom sense. I mean, you're an obvious example of somebody that certainly fills all those roles. Nick Starwark is an example of somebody that has fills all those roles. Larry Sharp is an example of somebody that has again fills all those roles. I mean, I don't want to have just a staff of yes men. I want to have a staff of people that really understand the constitutionality of things, that understand freedom and its values. And I think there's no shortage of people like that inside the Libertarian Party.
If you receive the Libertarian Party nomination, do you have a preference for your running mate?
No, for that, I strongly believe that should be left up to the delegates. I will say this, I would want a running mate with a lot of energy and a lot of passion. I want as much fire on the ticket as humanly possible. And so I wouldn't tell the delegates to do anything, because you can't tell libertarians to do anything ever, and you certainly can't tell delegates to do anything. But I would request that they look at whoever they believe has the fire, the charisma, the passion, and the knowledge of liberty, the deep knowledge of liberty, to effectively represent us in major media.
If you lost the LP nomination for president, would you accept the nomination for vice president?
Sure. Yeah. What the vice president needs to do primarily is be the media backup of the president. So if there's a major interview, the idea is usually the president takes it, the presidential nominee takes it. If the presidential nominee can't do it, then the vice presidential nominee takes it. And then, it goes to the next person, the next person, next person. In 2016, I was fourth in line. I was the vice chair. So it would go Gary Johnson, Bill Weld, Nick Sarwark than me. And I was often doing 2 or 3 media interviews a day. Gary Johnson was doing about 8 or 9. Bill Weld was also doing about 8 or 9. And that's really important work to be able to do that well. Now, as I've mentioned, I don't think that Bill Weld did it very well. I mean, he essentially soft endorsed Hillary 3 days before the election. And I don't want a vice presidential candidate who's going to do that. But as far as I can see, there are no currently declared vice presidential candidates where I'd be worried about anything like that happening.
Which former U.S. president did you admire the most?
Oh, there's a lot. There's a lot. I think that, I mean, Thomas Jefferson's a big one. Calvin Coolidge is a big one. And to me, Thomas Jefferson to me is this beautiful and tragic story of somebody that had the exact right ideas. And at this critical moment, he, like, you know, when he gave into that pressure to go away from his own principles, he knew deep down what we needed. We needed to have, you know, small independent farmers doing their own thing, you know, small cities. He knew what we needed. He knew that there should be very little executive power, right? And then he fell from his the principles that he should have had when it came to the time for the Louisiana Purchase. He believed that it would be dangerous to have another country right over there running that whole area. But that's actually wrong. Today, if the area today that we call the United States was 5 or 6 or 10 separate countries, we would be freer. We'd be freer because of competition. Because if one place raised their taxes too high, we would just go to the other place. And if the other place had too many regulations, we'd just go to the third place. So Thomas Jefferson was right there, poised and able to make the decision according to his own principles, not to mine, not to Alexander Hamilton's, not to John Adams, not to any George Washington, not to anybody, to his own principles. And if in that moment he'd stuck to his own principles, we'd have been in a radically different place today. And a lot of times today, when you're running for office, there's a lot of political pressure. There's political pressure, there's social pressure. And there are so many times where it would be so much easier for me to say, yeah, these are the principles, but you know, whatever, I'm going to go with whatever's easy. And I often think back to that time and think how much better we would be today if Thomas Jefferson had held to his principles just a little bit longer. We'd be so much better off. And so it inspires me to try to do that, to try to hold on to those principles as long as I possibly can. And so far, I've been able to stand up for principles without exception, without flinching, without backing down at all.
What politician, living or dead, did you admire the most?
For me, that's pretty easy. That's Ron Paul. And the moment where I think where I look up to him the most is not during the Ron Paul revolution. I mean, although I do respect him a lot for that. Not when he's talking about ending the Fed. There's an interview with him in the 1980s, the height of the drug war popularity, and he's on a talk show. He's saying we have to end the drug war, and he's being attacked. Right? He's being attacked by the host. He's being attacked by the audience. Everybody's against him. It's him and on one side and everyone else on the other side. And he holds his ground and he holds his ground and he holds his ground. And this is decades before the Ron Paul revolution, right? But in that moment, you see like what makes him so inspiring. You know, today people often who are not libertarians will look at him and say, you know, he's not that great a public speaker. And yeah, he's not that great a public speaker. But this is not about how much your voice carries or resounds or whatever, or how great you are, you know, how good you look on stage or whatever. This is about your principles. And what electrifies people, what electrified me about Dr. Paul was that he would stick to his principles no matter how strong the tides against him were. That to me is what I look up to. That's what I aspire to.
So Dr. Paul was famous both back then, I think in the interview you're talking about, which I'm not sure if it's the Phil Donahue one or the, what was it, Morton Downey Jr. or something like that.
Yeah, it was the second one.
The second one, okay. But also in one of the Republican presidential debates, he was famous for defending not only legalizing marijuana, but legalizing heroin. Mm-hmm. Where do you fall on that issue? Do you think
that was a gorgeous moment.
Do you think we should legalize all drugs, or we should just focus on marijuana?
Legalize everything. Every drug should be about as legal as just growing tomatoes in your backyard. It should be more legal than anything. It should just, whatever the most legal thing is right now, it should be more legal than that. To me, this comes down to a question of personal choice. And Dr. Paul said it beautifully to the audience. He said, how many of you, if heroin was legalized today, would start doing heroin? And everyone laughed because it's a laughable position. We don't get our morality from the government. We don't get our personal decision making from the government. I don't choose not to eat 50 bags of jelly beans every day because the government tells me not to. I choose not to do it because I recognize it has health consequences. I don't choose to work hard at my business because I'm required to. I choose because I think it's a good idea. I don't choose to read, books that I like more over books that I like less because of anything the government says. Again, these are individual choices. And when it comes down to it, heroin is just not really a good choice. For most people in most circumstances, heroin is the wrong answer. And because it's the wrong answer, we don't need the government stopping us from doing it. It's already a bad choice. We already have the natural free market handling it. These things have consequences. But Chuck, there's another part of it which is less popular to talk about with libertarians, and I do want to talk about those as well, which is I do believe that employers have the right to refuse to hire people who can't pass a drug test. One of the biggest hiring hurdles right now for employers is finding employees in Georgia and Colorado. The New York Times did an article about this. They can't hire people who can pass a drug test. That people just say, yeah, I don't want to take a drug test. And that's fine. They can refuse the drug test, but I think an employer has the right to say that for safety reasons or whatever, I want somebody who is absolutely sober. And these are often companies that are handling heavy machinery. And really, if there's some time where I want somebody to be very sober and lucid, it's when they're handling a wrecking ball. I don't want them knocking down the wrong place. So I do think that, yes, you have the right to do whatever you want, but I also believe that employers have the same right to hire whoever they want.
So I have a question from someone in the chat who seems a little skeptical, and I'll give it to you as he's written. What about people ruining people and ruining communities by dealing opiates? What do you think about that?
So the question to me is, are they doing it voluntarily or through force? So if somebody's going around a community forcibly injecting people with opiates, yeah, we have a problem there. Or somehow like filling their rooms with an aerosolized or smoked form of opiate, yeah, we have a problem there. But if somebody is offering opiates and people are buying it, well, yeah, that's an adult decision, and adults have to make adult decisions. Now, to me, what an adult is someone who can pay for themselves, who can provide for themselves, has their own house and whatever. So if you're, say, 17 years old, and you have your job and a house and a car, and then you choose to go buy opiates, yes, you've made an adult decision, and you're going to have to deal with the adult consequences. If you're not an adult, if you're 11 or 12, then it's your parents' job to control that decision making. It is not the president's job. It's not the community's job. It is your job, or it's your parents' job. Those are the only two people whose job it could be, or your legal guardian's job to protect you from that. So what prevents a 3-year-old from buying heroin is going to be the 3-year-old's parents, just like the 3-year-old's parents prevent the 3-year-old from buying 55 bags of candy of jelly beans. Similarly, or conversely, if you're 20, then you need to stop yourself from making those bad decisions. But at no point should the law be involved in this. The worst part about legal involvement is that when people are trying to turn their life around, when they're trying to get off the addiction, they can't turn to legal means. They are often afraid, rightly so, afraid of going to any kind of a medical support area because they're afraid they're going to get turned in. And there's a good reason for that. When they're struggling with this addiction, judges are often forced by law to, even when they're trying to get over the addiction, they're trying to get clean, judges are often forced by law to put them in jail if they have a relapse. And judges themselves, as I mentioned before, have spoken out against their own sentences. That's how much the people involved in this don't believe in it. To me, the opioid epidemic, as it's been called, is heavily fear-mongered. And what it should be called is, it's time for adults to act responsibly. If you have kids, you have to take care of your kids. And if you're an adult, you have to make your own adult decisions.
If you could change one government policy, just one, what would it be?
Get rid of government schools. Government schools do the most damage. They are the most expensive welfare program in the country, and to me, the most damaging welfare program in the country. They damage education. They damage people's sense of self-worth. They limit people's achievement. They limit people's excellence. They do so much harm and so little good that I would put them right at the top of my list.
Do you have any endorsements of your presidential campaign that you're proud of and want to highlight?
I mean, to me, every time that an individual person has spoken out in favor of my campaign, it's been exciting for me. To me, I don't put the endorsements by any group as above the endorsement of any individual. And I have been proud that a lot of individuals that I have respected have posted on Facebook supporting me. I don't know that any one is any more significant to me than any other, but I've been proud when people have said that I'm their favorite candidate, or have said things on Facebook or Twitter endorsing me.
Of the prior Libertarian Party presidential campaigns, from the start of the party until now,
Mhm.
which most closely resembles the campaign you want to run?
So there's two. I mean, in terms of principle, Dr. Paul's campaign. In terms of clarity of messaging, definitely Harry Brown's campaign. I mean, Harry Brown really got that point across where he talked about, here's what we need to end, here's why we need to end it, and here's why it's good. The main difference between Harry Brown and a lot of the subsequent candidates is that Harry Brown made it clear what he wanted to do. He talked about he wanted to get rid of Social Security, get rid of Medicare, get rid of Medicaid. He made that very, very clear. And he talked about why that would be beneficial. What we've seen from the last few candidates is basically an avoidance of any major or difficult topic. Bob Barr refused to talk about, he didn't refuse. He talked about, he said that he did not want to end the war on drugs. Gary Johnson refused to talk about it as part of their campaign strategy. That to me is a problem. And we have to be willing to discuss and explain to the adults who are voting why something's good. Politicians have started treating adults like children, like people who can't handle the truth, that are going to be too upset by any kind of reality other than the one they're accustomed to. And we have to start realizing that adults are adults, and they can handle things that are a little bit more complex than what people believe that adults can handle. And so I believe in treating people with respect. I believe in saying, here are the actual libertarian positions. And I'd love to talk about why they're good. And here's why I think they're good. And if somebody says, yeah, I don't want to hear anymore, fine. And somebody says, tell me more, great. If somebody wants to debate against me, even better, because that's where these ideas really come to the forefront.
What are a few of your favorite libertarian books, other than the ones you've written yourself?
Why Government Doesn't Work is a big one. That one I think really nicely
And that's
expresses
by Harry Brown,
that's
right?
by Harry Brown. Then another one, it's not strictly libertarian, but it's definitely something that was very much of an awakening for me, is the book The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. That's where I first started. It's like I'd always thought that taxation was theft, right? But I hadn't had this like psychological permission to think it. The Fountainhead just makes it so clear. Yeah, taxation is theft. It's just right there. Atlas Shrugged, taxation is theft. I don't know that those specific words are put together, but the message is very, very clear. And that was really important to me, and really shaped a lot of my early thinking in libertarianism. More recently, a lot of the essays written by Murray Rothbard, Walter Block, Dr. Ruart, those have been important because they address some of the most controversial issues, and they answer, how do we handle this without government? How do you handle these extremely incendiary, extremely emotional issues without government? And that to me is where I've learned a lot more recently about, what are the voluntarist answers to these difficult questions.
Speaking of incendiary issues, we do have another question from the chat. It deals with parental rights versus children's rights, I guess.
Mhm.
Should a parent be legally allowed to feed their children hard drugs such as heroin or cocaine?
No. And this is a big, and this question relates, and I'm glad this came up because this relates to a lot of things. I don't believe that a parent is an absolute owner of a child. I believe that a parent is a custodian of a child, and the parent's moral responsibility is to do their best for that child. And where this comes up, I mean, I don't think there's this big push of parents wanting to feed their kids cocaine that I know of. I mean, if it ever comes up, and I'm certainly going to speak out against it, both as a politician and as an educator, and I'll tell parents that if you want your kids to do well in life, don't force feed them heroin. It hasn't come up a lot though. But one thing that's actually similar that has come up is the question of vaccines. And one of the justifications for early childhood vaccination is that it protects not the child, but the community. And I don't actually believe that is a moral reason to vaccinate a child. A parent does not have that right. In the same way that a parent cannot donate their child's kidney, I don't believe that the parent can put their child at medical risk to benefit anyone other than the child. Now, if the parent says, I believe this vaccine will benefit the child, and and they're mistaken, that's different. That's still, I think, a morally okay thing to do. A parent's going to do their best to protect a child and make mistakes. That's fine. But that's not the same as sacrificing the needs of the child for the needs of anybody else. It is absolutely, in my view, absolutely morally wrong for a parent to sacrifice the needs of his or her own child for somebody else, because I don't believe that parents are absolute owners of children at all. To me, when we're looking at issues around any kind of consent, medical consent, sexual consent, whatever, the level that should be used is what's the currently accepted gold standard in medicine, which is what we call active and informed consent. Informed consent means that the person understands fully what they're consenting to. So as an example, somebody who's 3.5 years old could theoretically give active consent to gender reassignment surgery. However, I do not believe that somebody at that age, and this is my opinion as an educator, an expert in early childhood development, I do not believe that somebody at that age could possibly understand the nuanced understanding of what gender is, what it means to have the wrong gender, or any of that. Not to say that that person later on, as somebody older, couldn't understand it more completely, but I don't believe that somebody that age could, even in the wildest case, give any kind of informed consent. Active informed consent applies to everything, not just medicine, applies to sex. Here's a simple example. There could be two people who are both 30 years old, and they could both give active consent, right? But if one of them is married and hasn't told the other one, that's not informed consent. The person has not been given all of the relevant information. And so I view that as also morally problematic. What this comes down to is that consent has to be real. And real consent, to me, is exactly what you use in medical trials, is active and informed. And so if a doctor is doing a medical trial, it's not enough for a patient to say, yeah, sure, I'll take the pill. The doctor or the researcher has the legal responsibility and moral responsibility to ensure that the patient understands everything about it, understands all the risks associated with it, all of everything that could happen. And that's what active informed consent looks like. Today in America, we've gotten very far away from that. Today, we're taxed not just without active informed consent, we're often taxed against our direct objection. We have people who are religiously pacifist, who are morally pacifist, that are forced against their will to pay for wars with which they, at a fundamental level, do not agree. And I believe that's wrong. And that's one of the reasons I want to end the income tax.
So you just said that you think it's immoral for someone who is married to have sex with someone outside that marriage and not declare that fact to them, that doesn't let them give an informed consent.
Yes.
When you say it's immoral, should it also be illegal?
No. I don't think that things like this nuance should be handled by the law. I mean, the law is a government cudgel. It's a very unreliable, very imprecise tool. I want to compare government dispute resolution with what we have in the private sector. Today, in the private sector, sometimes we have disputes. And sometimes, for example, maybe you bought something online. Let's say you bought a t-shirt and you wanted a medium, but they sent a large, and now you're irate, right? What do? You have the free market equivalent of a court case, right? You go to Amazon, you pick your reason for returning it from a drop-down menu. They decide instantly in your favor. And it's like it happens so quickly and painlessly that you don't even get to feel a sense of victory, right? But that's what happened. You won a legal court case against a much more powerful company, and it was so easy, and it was so painless. It was so nothing. That, to me, is the advantage of the private sector. It can handle things better. And the private sector can handle much more serious things as well. When it comes to issues, for example, of sexual assault, many areas in which sexual assault is more likely, things that are social events, singles events, etc., have adopted different standards for their own businesses of safety. One extreme standard is basically that if there's any accusation made whatsoever, that person's going to be banned. Other people use the standards of preponderance of evidence rather than beyond reasonable doubt, and then that person will be banned. So the point is, the free market is able to provide these things better. When it comes down to things like, if you're married and you are having an affair and you have not told both parties that, yeah, that's not informed consent. You're just lying. That's uninformed. And to me, uninformed consent isn't really consent, because a person is not consenting to what's actually happening, because they don't know what's happening. They couldn't possibly consent to it. So to me, this is something that needs to be handled through private morality, through private decisions, private agreements, whatever, not through government involvement.
So I have two questions here. I usually ask them separately, but sometimes people conflate them. So I'm going to ask you both questions, and then you can respond to both questions. The first one is, why are you the best candidate to represent the libertarian brand?
Mm-hmm.
And the second one is, why are you the best candidate to build the Libertarian Party and the libertarian movement? So could you respond to each of those?
Sure. And I have a lot of experience in building the libertarian brand, and that experience has showed me what we actually need to be doing. So when I first got into the Libertarian Party national branding, I thought it was an optics issue, right? I thought, we had the website was outdated. I thought we needed a better logo. I thought we needed more effective social media. And I worked on each of those projects. I worked to build the social media. I worked with a huge program to get a new logo. I worked on the committee to get a new website. So I was actively involved in every single one of those things, most of which I spearheaded. And so I am completely open to the idea that the graphical imaging and the branding matters. But at the end of all of that, here's what I started to see. At the end of all of that, when we would post something on social media about getting rid of government schools, we were getting pushback from libertarians. And that's weird to me, because anarchism, minarchism, voluntarism, and classical liberalism all agree that there should be no government schools. And so I realized that our branding issue was not one of presentation, but one of clarity. If we had so poorly described libertarianism that people believe that government schools fit inside of it, we had failed in a different type of branding. And that's why I do my best to speak as unambiguously and often incendiarily as possible. My second choice for president, by the way, is Adam Kokesh. And the big difference you'll see between my messaging and his, we have, by the way, essentially the same platform. We have the same views, the same goals, but there's a big difference in our messaging. Adam talks about localization. And to me, the problem with using the word localization is that it's too easily misinterpreted. Somebody can hear localization and say, oh, public schools should be locally controlled. I agree with that. But that's not what he means, and it's certainly not what I mean. So I do my best to be very, very, very clear. And I think by being clear, we can build a house of bricks rather than a house of straw. We can build something strong and resilient. And so if I'm the nominee, we are going to be attracting people who believe in one of two things. They either believe in libertarianism or they just believe in honesty. Because for all the many things that my political distractors have said, I don't think anybody's ever accused me of not being honest. I am going to be the clear, honest, forthright candidate, because I don't believe that libertarianism needs to be hidden behind something else. Libertarianism is beautiful. Libertarianism is the best philosophy. Libertarianism, if allowed to compete openly and honestly will win. It's the most ethical philosophy. It's the most practical approach. It is the best option. But if we kind of tone it down and refuse to talk about it, we're not going to get anywhere. The Ron Paul Institute recently mocked one of Justin Amash's 10-minute major media interview, where they said in 10 minutes, he didn't say anything libertarian at all. And that to me is a problem. I promise you this, if I have 10 seconds, I'm going to say something big and libertarian so that people understand what libertarianism is. People have said that, hold on one second, that the worst thing for liberty is not that it be attacked, but that it be ineffectively defended. And right now we have candidates that are refusing to defend it at all. Some of the two popular candidates right now, we have Judge Jim Gray and Justin Amash. Both have called for increases in government. Judge Jim Gray has talked about what he calls a negative income tax, which is just a UBI, because to me, a negative income tax isn't really a negative income tax if other people are paying a positive income tax. It's just regular old welfare state wealth redistribution. Justin Amash has called for an increase in Medicaid spending, as well as voted for an increase in public school spending. That to me, while I see why it would be popular among Democrats and Republicans, is the exact wrong message for a libertarian spokesperson. The top of the ticket needs to clearly define what libertarianism is and what it is not, so that people can make an active, informed decision before they join our party. I don't want to trick anybody into being here. Just as I said before, I think it's wrong to trick people into a sexual relationship. I think it's wrong to trick people into a political relationship. The principle of active, informed consent applies to everything. And before anybody calls themselves or joins the Libertarian Party, I want them to make sure that they fully understand what that means, that we're not lying to anybody or tricking anybody in any way whatsoever.
So you've talked about Brandon. Do you feel that you've answered the second question, which is how are you the best candidate to build the Libertarian Party and the Libertarian movement?
Sure. The biggest jobs of the candidate is it's going to be the major media interviews. And I think I've shown in my major media interviews that I can accomplish a lot in a 5-minute interview. And that's what you get with major media. It's mostly 5-minute interviews. I've shown that I can hammer home major points in short interviews. And it's not just my opinion. Some of my media interviews have been quoted, for example, by WikiLeaks Twitter, getting thousands and thousands of retweets on Twitter, because I know how to do it, to put forth a bold position in a way that's clear first, and second, exciting and engaging both libertarians and non-libertarians. That's my strength, and I promise you this: I will say more clear, powerful libertarian things in 1 minute than anybody else is going to say in 10.
Have you spoken with policy experts at libertarian think tanks about various issue positions? And do you have policy experts advising your campaign?
I mean, hundreds of times. I mean, I live in DC, so I've spoken, and this has been more informally, right? I've spoken to often for many hours with people who are at Cato, at R Street Institute, at other think tanks, to just get their insights. And some of those have been people who are giving me libertarian insights. Some of the people have been giving me non-libertarian insights. For my campaign, there's a lot of people who have been advising me specifically recently on medical policy, because that's kind of pretty big right now. And I spent, again, hours on the phone with people trying to understand some of the nuances of medical policy. A lot of the stuff was stuff that I didn't know before. For example, the idea of certificate of need, when I learned about that actually relatively recently, and I was just shocked. I couldn't believe that something so bizarre could exist. So I do have people advising me. I've gotten a lot of advice for people on drug policy. So and again, they're not speaking from a libertarian perspective. They're just telling me about drugs. A simple example: I didn't know until this campaign, and this was a couple of years ago, I didn't understand that smoked marijuana and ingested marijuana affect the body actually quite differently. And that to me is a very important thing to understand as we look at drug policy. So I have had the benefit of a lot of insight. Of a lot of people to advise me on policy positions. But I'll tell you this, Chuck: the place that I've gotten the most insights on policy positions has actually been from the other presidential candidates, believe it or not. I've probably learned more from even, say, Dan Berman, one of the other candidates. I've learned more from him this last year than I had in libertarianism in the previous 2 years. These are people who have ironed out their policy thoughts a lot, and we've debated and we've discussed during debates and before and after debates. We've had long in discussions via Facebook Live and Zoom and other types of things. And in that, I've learned a lot from them. So I would say right now, in addition to the people that I'm treating more as advisors, the other candidates have actually been some of my best advisors.
If you receive the Libertarian Party nomination, will you campaign full-time for the general election, or will this be a part-time thing as you manage your education business?
So a few years ago, when I decided that I wanted to do this, I started putting things into place to allow my education business to run without me. To use a simple example, right now we're in the middle of class. I mean, I'm not in the middle of class, but right now class is going on. It's a heavy class with a lot of exciting stuff happening, and the way we teach is pretty involved and pretty intensive. But because of the specific changes that I made to the business, both with myself and with the help of our director of operation, who's really a wizard at stuff like that, Chelsea Snyder, we've gotten the business specifically ready to allow me to campaign full time. Before the house arrest orders were issued, I was campaigning a lot. I mean, I was traveling every single weekend to a different state, driving through multiple states, attending doing many interviews, going to many debates, going to different conventions. So I was doing a pretty heavy schedule before, but I've specifically planned that if I'm the nominee, I'm going to be able to dedicate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and make this an absolutely epic campaign.
That ties into my next question. What kind of campaign will you run? Will you be traveling a lot and speaking at events, or will you be running a media-focused campaign? Will you be campaigning with down-ticket Libertarian Party candidates, or will you be doing your own thing?
So my answer a few months ago would have been different. I mean, it's the things have changed a lot. And from every medical expert I've talked to, and there's been a lot, and these are people who I trust. These are people with advanced degrees in medicine and often additional PhDs in a related field. And everyone has said the same thing, that there are not going to be any large meetings, that large meetings are not going to be able to be possible for about a year. And so my hope is that they're wrong. I mean, because as you probably know, I love speaking in person. I love meeting people in person. I mean, that's what I like to do, and that's my strength. But if that's just not possible, even if I hold a rally and no one's allowed to come to it, then I'm going to have to really shift directions on that. So what we've been planning for in the campaign is we've been experimenting with Zoom and all that and seeing what we can do using some of those tools. I've been making sure that I have at all times 3 computers set up for like media level interviews. I've changed the layout of the place and whatnot so that we're ready for, even in case of full power outages, to keep running interviews for several hours until all of our battery backups die. So we're ready to do that. So in the current state, out of necessity, we would have to use the following tools. One, using Zoom, again, to campaign both independently and with down ticket people. And to use an example, this was not something that I did. This was actually initiated by Anthony Welty. But Anthony Welty has been doing he's in Washington State, has been doing cross ballot discussions with a lot of candidates. And I would definitely want to use that similar model where I would use whatever attention's coming to my campaign to bring that to other state, local, and federal candidates. And again, if I'm the nominee, I'm also going to be doing, ideally, probably quite a bit of quite a few media interviews. I'm totally ready to do that. I have the equipment ready to do that. I've practiced it many times, and I've done many interviews, many major media interviews from home, so I know how to do it. So I'm definitely ready to hit the ground running on that. And I've been doing during this outbreak, I have been doing major media interviews from home, and I'm ready for that.
Will you remain in the Libertarian Party for far into the future, whether you win or lose this nomination?
I don't know. I mean, I've been in the Libertarian Party for a long time, and as far as I know, I'm going to be in the Libertarian Party for a much longer time. But again, to me, and this goes to my deep thinking on a lot of issues. The way that I run my business, for example, is we don't actually have any contracts in my business. And that's one major difference between my program and a lot of other programs. Most places, you sign up for a class, you pay in advance and all that. And we strongly don't believe in that, because our view is we should be earning your business every single class. And if your class wasn't that good, why should you be forced to come back? So because of that, and that's what's built my business, this idea by not having that long-term contract, we don't do that. So the question is, will I stay in the Libertarian Party? I assume so. I mean, I don't see any reason that I wouldn't. But then again, it's not a hard commitment. So if it turns out that the Libertarian Party goes, full tilt socialist, am I going to stay? Probably not. I mean, I don't see that trying to promote something that I disagree with really makes any sense. People have asked if I would support any of the other nominees. There's a lot of nominees I would support. There's a lot of nominees I wouldn't support, but there's no nominee that would cause me to leave the party as a whole. There's just nominees that I just don't think are people that I would personally support for the nomination.
So that concludes my pre-written questions, but I have a few questions for the audience if you have a few more minutes.
Yeah, sure.
And I've interspersed some of their questions already, but I still have maybe a handful left. So the first one is, do you believe that antitrust, anti-monopoly, and similar laws with the purpose of creating, in their words, a legally mandated free market, are or are not against the spirit of libertarianism?
I think they are against the spirit, and I think that there's a bit of a red herring there, because monopolies can't exist in the long term without government help. All the monopolies that exist today are there because of the government. And every area in which there is no government involvement, there just aren't really any monopolies. You look at the things that are closest to monopolies, and they have like no power. People might say, well, like Microsoft is kind of a monopoly, I guess, but you also have Apple. Right now I'm having this conversation with you on a Linux computer, and even on Linux, there's like 50,000 different versions of Linux that you can choose from. So the free market doesn't really allow monopolies to persist. It's true that somebody could create a monopoly for a short amount of time, but only government allows those monopolies to become entrenched. And so to me, the way to get rid of monopolies, to get rid of their entrenchment, is to get rid of the government that supports them, to get rid of the government support for those monopolies.
So there's a follow-up question, and I think you've already answered it, but I'll ask it anyway in case there's anything you want to add.
Sure.
Will antitrust enforcement take place under a Vohra administration?
There just wouldn't be any need for it. There won't be the possibility of creating a trust. I mean, to create a monopoly without government, it's like undoable in anything except for some very bizarre theoretical circumstance. I mean, it's not really a thing that can be done, and it certainly can't be entrenched without government. When it comes to antitrust, listen, if two companies want to collude, go ahead, let them collude. And in doing so, they're just weakening themselves and making themselves not able to compete. We've seen collusion in plenty of American industries that weren't cracked out, where the crackdowns weren't happening. I believe that for many years there was soft collusion between all American auto companies. The result was that they simply were not able to survive against the foreign entrants. And so collusion, it's a bad long-term strategy. You should be working to make yourself more innovative, lighter, more efficient, not find a way to like short-term make the market favor you. It's a short-term gain for a long-term loss. And companies that do it, I'll tell you this, in a Vohra administration will never be bailed out. There's not going to be any bailouts. So if you're thinking short term, fine, think short term. But understand long term, your company might not exist.
So I have another final question for the chat that seemed like more of a thought, and this was in response to you had said that the war in Afghanistan and Iraq was over when we got Osama bin Laden. So let's pull out and bring home. So someone in the chat said, if he brought back all the troops, then we'd be back to the day one. If we pull out, there'd be a power vacuum, and we want to establish democracy in Afghanistan. So how do you respond to that? Was that another goal of the war in Afghanistan? Should it have been a goal? Should America be trying to establish a democracy? And if so, is it working? Is it not?
Let's think about, Chuck, why we hated the Bolsheviks, because their view was to establish communism by force, right? Nobody hates like the Israeli kibbutz, because the Israeli kibbutzes, because they're doing communism. They're communist societies. They're big, fat commie pinkos, but nobody really hates them for it because they're not trying to force it on anybody else. Democracy leads and spreads when it leads by example. The United States should act as a city upon a hill, showing how good democracy is. If something needs to be sold at gunpoint, maybe it's just not that good. And who knows, maybe democracy isn't the right answer for some of those places right now. Maybe the correct answer is small tribal units where people can go from one to the other, treating them as competing governments. Maybe the correct answer is something else entirely. Maybe the correct answer is an American-style republic, a constitutional republic. Maybe the correct answer is a British-style parliamentary democracy. We don't know what that is, and that's something for them to figure out, not something for us to force on them. Think of it like this. I live in Maryland, and the state house in Annapolis, they hate when DC tells them what to do. And you'll hear them saying like, DC shouldn't be telling Maryland what to do. And I agree, DC shouldn't be telling Maryland what to do because Maryland is its own place. But here's the thing. People in DC, in the federal government, they more or less get Maryland culture. They understand our language, they understand our traditions, they understand what we're about. The people in DC, they don't understand what people in Afghanistan are about. They don't speak the language. They don't understand the tradition. They don't know the history. They've never been there. They don't get it. It's not their culture, and it shouldn't be their government. I've said before that this culture produced this government. That's not a bad thing. Culture should produce government, and cultures can be changed, and those changes should produce different governments. The culture over there, that should produce the government that makes sense for them. And I do believe that we can work to change that culture. I have huge problems with that culture. The culture in Afghanistan and Iraq has major problems. They're terrible towards, they're brutal and terrible towards women. A lot of their other ideas are extremely backwards. I'm not saying that I support their cultures. I don't. I think they need to change. But we need to change their culture through reason, through logic, through example, through information, not through force. Because if you change a culture through force, the only message that people are going to hear is that it is okay to change a government through force. And once we establish that as a rule, I promise you other places will take that to heart, and we're going to see new governments being established by force time and time again.
So, Arvin, that concludes the questions that I had prepared and the questions from the audience. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to talk about?
No, I think we really covered a lot of major areas. I do want to thank you for taking the time to do this. You know, it's rare on these on a campaign that you really get into the issues. So I really appreciate your taking the time to really get into these issues in a way that's really rare as part of politics today.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it. I'm going to put this interview on YouTube, and hopefully we can spread it around. Do you want to again, one last time, tell people where they can find out more information about your campaign and give one last pitch for people's vote?
Sure, absolutely. If you want to learn more, there's two things I want to pitch. First, if right now you're stuck at home and you're homeschooling and you're not liking it too much, and you're like, man, is there some better way to do this? Please check out our free guides at the AP Homeschool Project. That's aphomeschool.com. It tells you exactly what to do to make your homeschool experience the best it could possibly be. It's completely free. Everything's out there. We put a lot of work into it, a lot of thought into it, and really hope that people get some benefit from it. If you want to follow my campaign, if you want to learn more about my campaign, please follow me on Facebook and follow and go to my website. That's votevohra.com. My last name is spelled V as in Victor, Ohra.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for watching. So at this point, I'm going to end by rating someone. Does anyone in the chat have an idea of a good political streamer? If so, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to rate a chess streamer because I don't see any political streamers out here now. Thanks so much to Arvin for talking with me. And I guess I'm going to end here with a raid. And Arvin, I look forward to seeing you if we have an in-person convention. Although, honestly, I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to go all online. Yeah. So, I look forward to seeing you whenever we have our next in-person convention, whatever that may be.
Awesome. Likewise, Chuck.
Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye.
All right, you too.